The Committee on Transportation Infrastructure will come to order, and I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, that is so ordered. As a reminder, if members insert a document in the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. With that, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement. We're here today to discuss the discretionary grant programs at the Department of Transportation, to hear firsthand from stakeholders about their experiences with the department's grant processes. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, authorized $196 billion over 5 years for new and existing DOT competitive grant programs. This represents 30% of the total funding provided by the IIJA. The committee has a keen interest in ensuring that these taxpayer-funded grants follow the intent of the law and support projects that actually improve our nation's infrastructure, network, and the supply chain. The committee has heard concerns from stakeholders regarding the implementation of the IIJA, specifically citing the department's delay and inconsistencies with the nuances of notices of funding opportunities, or NOFOs, and the length of time it takes to execute grant agreements after an award has been announced. On the front end of the process, NOFOs have incorporated the administration's executive orders on climate, equity, and environmental justice into their grant criteria, requiring applicants to demonstrate efforts in advancing the administration's very progressive agenda. For example, a recipient of the 2023 Safe Streets and Roads for All grant award not only must certify compliance with 75 federal laws and regulations, but they must also certify compliance with 12 executive orders. These additional criteria may include otherwise qualified projects from receiving federal funding for worthwhile infrastructure improvements. On the back end, grant recipients are experiencing longer than normal wait times for the execution of grant agreements. As a result, IIJA funds are trickling out, limiting the ability of stakeholders to put these funds to good use. As the committee prepares for the next highway bill in the next Congress, it's important that we continue to ensure that the best use of the infrastructure funding and find ways to improve the grant process. I also look forward to hearing from each of our witnesses today, including one from my district, who I'll introduce here in just a little bit, about their experience in applying for federal funding and how they are using federal dollars to improve the state of our nation's transportation network. I now recognize Ranking Member Larson for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Graves, for holding this hearing to explore how competitive grant funds from the bipartisan infrastructure law are providing opportunities and delivering results. The law provides record-breaking funding for critical infrastructure projects. Over 5 years, the BIL invests $661 billion in roads, bridges, transit, buses, ferries, airports, ports, and rail. Congress provided 30% of this amount, about $196 billion, to be distributed through 72 competitive grant programs. Many of these grant programs were established in the BIL, and this investment level and volume of new initiatives far exceeds previous transportation bills. DOT has risen to the occasion to get this money into the hands of communities by issuing nearly 90 notices of funding opportunities, or NOFOs, in the 2 years since the enactment of the law. And this level of grant making is remarkable. Compared to formula funds, these grants provide new and expanded opportunities for local and tribal governments to pursue local priorities and receive grant awards directly. For example, the BIL Safe Streets and Roads for All program, for which states are not eligible to apply, is widely heralded as a model for assistance to local governments to improve safety. In the first 2 rounds of funding, over 1,000 local safety projects received grants, a huge boost to communities with needs that may not rise to the top of state DOT priorities. Congress also delivered an unprecedented 5 years of funding certainty for rail in the BIL, a level of commitment not seen since the creation of Amtrak over 50 years ago. The Federal Railroad Administration has awarded over 238 rail projects under BIL, including a $2 million grant to the city of Burlington in my district for a railroad crossing elimination. FRA is working with communities to develop or enhance as well in 69 intercity passenger rail corridors nationwide. Yet, much of this BIL discretionary rail funding is subject to appropriation and therefore at the mercy of caps and cuts, because rail does not have a dedicated revenue source. And the cuts to Amtrak in the proposed THUD bill, which stalled consideration in the bill last fall, demonstrated this committee will have to remain vigilant to protect investment in rail. Infrastructure investment means jobs. Ensuring that infrastructure projects ensuring that infrastructure benefits reach all communities requires a strong working relationship among federal, state, regional, and local government partners. My state of Washington has a robust process to distribute transportation dollars to all areas, including rural counties and communities in my district. WashDOT leads the process by partnering with local governments and passing through federal transportation dollars with a lot of input from state legislators, I might add as well. Distribution of transportation funding through the state legislature further supports the reach into the communities. As a result, we have seen success in addressing transportation needs in my district and other districts around the state. This collaboration further supports success in the competitive grant process. Local governments, including Whatcom and Skagit counties, and the tribes, such as Lummi Nation in my district, have successfully applied for and been awarded grants. So in all, Washington, in my district, it's received more than $120 million in competitive grants from the BIL, so it can happen. We're only 2 years through a 5-year bill, which means there's more to come. More projects, more jobs, more safety improvements, more pollution reduction, and more communities uplifted. Congress directed investments in the BIL to address climate change and reduce carbon pollution as well. We've directed these investments to improve safety and equity outcomes on our transportation network. And as we put more decision-making power into the hands of local communities who know their needs best. DOT's grant competitions reflect these directives from Congress. DOT's competitive grant considerations align with goals shared by those who voted for the BIL and are advancing cleaner, safer, and more equitable transportation. Now, beyond the benefits of individual projects, BIL resources are building local government capacity to deliver projects. Because in some respects, the local governments don't have that capacity to apply for these grants. So DOT is actively helping applicants new to the federal transportation grant process to navigate this competitive process. The Thriving Communities program supports disadvantaged and under-resourced communities to advance transportation projects. The program's capacity builder organizations work directly with local communities to build their technical knowledge. The first year of funding, $21 million, supported 64 communities, including 27 in rural areas. This program to build the bench of project sponsors will transform communities that have not previously accessed federal funds and will deliver jobs, mobility improvements, and economic benefits for years to come, especially in rural areas. So I welcome this opportunity to celebrate the benefits to each of our districts and constituents. Also, I welcome the opportunity to look at how we can make it better. As a former county council member, I can assure you I understand the frustration that counties and cities have in accessing federal money, and sometimes they choose not to. So I fully understand that. But we are making progress in this particular version of the transportation funding through the BIL to try to address that technical capacity deficit so that, again, we can build a longer-term bench to increase the number of project sponsors for competitive grants. I will finally say that there is one area where state legislatures, state DOTs, local governments, city and county and tribal governments all agree. There's never enough money from the federal government when it comes to transportation funding. So if we can all agree on that as we look forward to the 2026 when we have to do this all over again, we should keep that in mind as well as we're looking to improve the process. With that, I yield back.
Thanks, Rick. And I do want to welcome all of the witnesses here today, and just to kind of briefly explain the lights. You'll each have 5 minutes to give your testimony, and then green is go, and yellow means you're running out of time, and red is try to conclude as quickly as possible. With that, I'd ask unanimous consent that witnesses' full statements be included in the record, and without objection, that is so ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, that is so ordered. I'd also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for an additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, that is so ordered. As your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the committee asks that you, as I mentioned earlier, limit remarks to 5 minutes. So before we get to our witnesses, I do want to welcome some constituents in the audience today. Pike County Presiding Commissioner Bill Allen, is in the office, and Audrain County Road and Bridge Engineer Brian Hafner. Welcome to both of you for coming in and helping out with this. Our first witness today is also a constituent of mine, and I want to welcome Alan Winders, the presiding commissioner of Audrain County. He also serves as chairman of the Better 54 Coalition. The Better 54 Coalition has been working to make improvements to Highway 54 between Mexico, Missouri, and Louisiana, Missouri. He's also the chairman of the Mark Twain Regional Council of Governments. And given those roles, he's very familiar with applying for DOT grants as well as many other grants. Thanks for making the trip out, Alan. I really appreciate you being here, and with that, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to be here today. There is only one Audrain County in all of these great United States, and it's my great honor to be the presiding commissioner. It is also my honor to be here today. Audrain County is about 700 square miles, about 25,000 people, and is a rural county in northeast Missouri. It's rural by all definitions. Today, I'm here as a capacity as a member of the National Association of Counties, or NACO, which represents the interest of each of America's 3,069 counties, parishes, and boroughs. Thank you for the opportunity to provide the county perspective on U.S. Department of Transportation's discretionary grant process as it relates to programs in the IIJA. Nationally, America's counties own 44% of roads and 38% of bridges. In Audrain County, it's a little higher than that, but annually, America's counties invest over $60 million in the construction, maintenance, and operation of the nation's transportation systems. We're doing our part at the local level. County-owned roads and bridges do not receive any direct guaranteed federal support, although they serve far more than just our residents. Making matters worse, 45 states, including Missouri and Washington, cap the ability of counties to increase revenues in various ways. In rural America, where tax bases are small, our ability to maintain infrastructure is even further strained, leading to dangerous conditions. Sadly, a driver is twice as likely to die in a crash on a rural road than an urban road. In rural areas, however, where almost 70% of the nation's transportation system lies, along local roads and bridges that make up the first and last mile of America's daily commutes. America's food leaves the farm on local roads. Foremost, America's counties are tremendously grateful for the funding opportunities in the IIJA and urge lawmakers to protect the level of investment in the next law. Competitive grant programs represent the only way counties can access federal transportation funds to carry out the projects that we deem a priority, and for that, we are immensely grateful. When counties are successful, countless examples demonstrate our ability to turn federal investments into real-life projects that improve the quality of life for our residents. However, competing is not easy. Not only do counties have to compete with ourselves, we also must vie with cities, states, regional organizations, tribal governments, and others. Like Audrain, 2/3 of America's counties are rural and have serious capacity constraints that put the average county at a great competitive disadvantage in federal grant programs because these programs are structured to reward applicants that have the most resources. This means that urban centers are typically successful while smaller entities struggle to compete, even though the infrastructure serving these communities is no less important. From interstates to gravel roads, all parts of the system are critical to its efficient operation. Small and rural counties simply do not have the resources to determine which grant program is the right fit, prepare or contract out a competitive application, complete environmental reviews, meet the local match, etc. Other challenges exist that we've seen firsthand through our role in the Highway 54 Coalition. While this project is critical to our region, we lose rating points in the RAISE application based on unrelated, non-statutory criteria. While the IIJA significantly increased the number of competitive programs counties can apply to, it did not change how the programs are fundamentally structured, applying the same reporting requirements to state departments of transportation and rural counties alike. This is true for counties of all size. Overly complex regulations and guidance can make implementing an award just about as challenging as competing for it. When we are successful, counties need responsive federal partners who produce timely and clear directives that do not prescribe how funds are spent beyond what is required in the statute. Federal permitting requirements can also make competitive grant programs unattractive for potential applicants. Too often, simple local projects that use federal funding trigger NEPA even when they are carried out in an already disturbed public right-of-way where categorical exclusion should apply. Awardees are reporting unprecedented timelines of up to 24 months for grant agreements. Delays of this nature degrade investment and slow the delivery of projects. We strongly encourage the U.S. Department of Transportation to address this issue. In closing, the message is simple. Please get grant funds out the door as quickly as possible. Counties stand ready to work with you as willing and able partners to help ensure the dollars invested in our nation's infrastructure over the course of the IIJA continue to benefit Americans for generations to come. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee for the opportunity to be here today to give some feedback on how we see the program working from our perspective, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. Next up is Mr. Chuck Baker, who's the president of the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. Mr. Baker, 5 minutes.
Thank you. On behalf of the nation's 600 Class 2 and 3 small business freight railroads, commonly known as short lines, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. The short line industry exists to preserve rail lines that would otherwise have been at risk of abandonment. These lines were expensive to maintain, didn't have much traffic, were generally unprofitable and unloved by their previous owners. After the Staggers Act of 1980 allowed them to be sold to local entrepreneurs instead of abandoned, the new short line owners focused on customer service, business development, running a low-cost operation, and trying to scrounge up the funds to rehabilitate the infrastructure. Overall, this has worked quite well, and it's generally considered an American success story. We now support 478,000 jobs and 10,000 businesses nationwide. To keep that infrastructure functional, we invest up to a third of our revenues in it, which makes short-line railroading one of the most capital-intensive industries in the country. I know many members of this committee have visited your local short lines and have heard from customers about how important rail service is to their business. If you haven't made it out yet, we're happy to facilitate. Short lines partner closely with everyone in their community, shippers, economic development offices, and local and federal officials, which brings me to the subject of federal grants. We are proud to work closely with Congress and the USDOT in strengthening the country's rail network. Federal grant funding helps our industry advance the goals we all share: improving safety, creating economic opportunities, supporting well-paying jobs, ensuring an efficient supply chain, defending America's freight network from malicious actors, and harnessing the environmental benefits of moving freight by rail. The key federal grant program for short lines is the FRA's CRISI program. More than $12 billion is needed to allow short lines to fully modernize our infrastructure and meet the country's freight needs. In 2015, Congress recognized this and created the CRISI program, and then built upon it in the 2021 infrastructure law, giving it guaranteed appropriations. The program also has a clear safety mission. Each dollar of CRISI rebuilding work helps prevent derailments, given that the leading cause of derailments on short lines is simply old, worn-out track. Because we partner with USDOT on CRISI, railroad crossing elimination, infra, RAISE, and PIDP, we have insight into ways the grant process can be improved, and I'll highlight a few of those now. One, we support robust permanent staffing at the FRA so they can develop subject matter expertise and advance NOFO's selections and project execution more quickly through the pipeline. Two, we urge Congress to protect CRISI's ability to address the needs of freight rail. There are some efforts to expand CRISI eligibility to include commuter rail. We oppose this. We do partner with commuter rail and passenger rail and call them friends, but they can already avail themselves of other sizable funding streams that are closed off to short lines. There was $66 billion dedicated to rail in the infrastructure bill. 58 of that was set aside for passenger rail, 3 for greater separations, and 5 for CRISI. Given that, we do think it would be okay for CRISI to focus a bit more heavily on freight in the future. 3, the FRA should ensure that small freight rail projects continue to receive fair consideration and that a few larger projects don't blot out the sun, taking finite resources away from smaller dollar but highly impactful short line projects. 4, provide predictable, regular grant application timing and confidence in the amount of funding available. This means that Congress can encourage the FRA to stick to regular annual timing on a given grant program, that federal agencies should just run 1 year of funding at a time rather than combining NOFOs and creating a lumpier program, and Congress should continue to provide advance appropriations like it did in IIJA, which has been a real game changer for predictability and planning. And 5, streamline processes such as NEPA, which can needlessly delay important projects that clearly won't have any meaningful environmental impact. Grants can be a huge help, but I do have to note a few challenges that may underline some of those gains. California now has a misguided environmental rule on the books that means some short lines would, quote unquote, be eliminated due to the cost of proposed regulations. And that is CARB's words, not mine. It's especially galling considering how beneficial for the environment it is to move goods by rail. EPA is now reviewing a waiver request from California to allow them to advance this rule, which we hope they reject. We're also braced for an imminent crew size rule from the FRA that would mandate some of our members hire personnel they don't need, forcing small railroads who already operate with tight margins to invest limited resources in the wrong places. We hope to continue working with this committee to overcome those challenges, just as we work so well together to advance investments into short-line rail infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we will hear from Ms. Amy O'Leary, who's the Executive Director of the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. SEMCOG is a regional planning agency serving almost 5 million people in the 7-county area of Metro Detroit. We are a local government association with over 180 members that are cities, villages, townships, and counties. As the Metropolitan Planning Organization, SEMCOG is responsible for ensuring data-driven, efficient use of the transportation funds. This includes development of a long-range transportation plan for our complex system of roads, bridges, transit, non-motorized transportation, and freight. We also develop and manage the current list of federally funded road projects, which for 23 through 26 totals $5.8 billion in federal funds. Discretionary funds have made a significant difference in our region, which can be described in 3 buckets. Bucket 1 involves emerging issues and current challenges. Our best example is Safe Streets for All grant. While we were making progress on road safety prior to the pandemic, we experienced a spike in fatalities during and post-pandemic. Safety is one of several issues best understood and addressed at the local level, which is why we have advocated for the direct funding to MPOs, cities, and counties. SEMCOG proactively adopted a data-driven safety plan, and the award of over $10 million will help us put this plan into action via safety audits on our high-injury roads and quick-build safety pilot projects. In addition to SEMCOG's grant, communities in our region received over $80 million, including construction funds awarded to the cities of Detroit and Dearborn. Due to the immense need to improve transportation safety nationwide, we would encourage considering a formula program in the future. The second bucket of discretionary funds is focused on innovation, and the PROTECT grant program focuses on innovation and resiliency. Like many parts of the country, we've experienced an increase in extreme weather and flooding. SEMCOG works to find solutions, including developing a nationally recognized flood risk tool and coming up with updated current and future precipitation estimates with our experts. This work sets us apart and makes us ready to develop an actionable transportation resiliency improvement plan under PROTECT. This funding will accelerate the implementation of projects to manage these flooding events by identifying the best locations and the best techniques that we should be using. Another innovative program is the Reconnecting Communities Grant, which provides funding to address the physical barriers due to dividing communities and neighborhoods from important services due to highways. In partnership with the state of Michigan, our region received $21 million in the city of Oak Park, which is divided in half by I-696. With significant disadvantaged populations, the project will provide access to local businesses and schools by foot and improve connectivity. The third bucket of discretionary funds is for large projects which exceed the scope of formula funding, including infra and raise. Innovate Mound in Macomb County received $98 million through this program to reconstruct 9 miles of road to support economic development in the state's defense corridor. A $104 million infra grant will help to reconnect one of Detroit's once predominantly black and economically strong neighborhoods that was divided by highway construction. The reconstruction of I-375 will convert a sunken freeway to a lower-speed surface-level boulevard. The third project is a $24 million investment through the Railroad Elimination Grant Program for a grade separation in the city of Monroe. This critical project will improve response time for emergency vehicles and increase safety. Finally, I'd like to mention the critical roles regions play in pursuing these discretionary funds. One way we assist is by applying for the funds on behalf of our local communities and then passing those dollars through to our communities. We also assist by convening meetings with community leaders and developing partnerships to determine the most strategic way to pursue the grants and which grants to pursue. Regions play a key role for frustrated communities who don't have the capacity or resources to apply. In response to these frustrations, we partnered with the State of Michigan's Infrastructure Office, who developed a program to write grants and provide match through a vetted process. I would like to conclude by thanking members of the committee and acknowledging the important role that regions do play in providing much of the needed fund that helps us do our job and improve the lives of our residents. Thank you.
I'll now turn it over to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster, to introduce our next witness.
Thank you, Chairman. Appreciate that. Today I'm honored to introduce the Secretary of the Florida Department of Transportation, the Honorable Jared Perdue. And I just want to tell you, he's a hard worker. Matter of fact, he began his career with Florida Department of Transportation, and he's still there. And he's worked his way through just about every position there is, and learned much about what we need in Florida, and is a valued asset to this panel. So I'm appreciative of that. His leadership roles are known, and he also knows Florida's transportation better than anybody. And he also knows the struggles our state's had in facing the implementation of federal discretionary grants and how difficult that is. In addition to graduating from the Citadel with a civil engineering degree, he also is a family man. He has 5 daughters, and we're proud of that. And he's a hard worker, and he is a motivated public servant, sticking it out with the Florida Department of Transportation, and we appreciate that. I'm encouraged that Florida is well represented here today because it is a large department and it's one that needs to be heard from on this very, very important issue. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Thanks for being here, Secretary Perdue. Sorry I missed our meeting yesterday. I was on the floor. But with that, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Webster, for the introduction. Thank you, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of today's hearing. It truly is an honor, and I appreciate your commitment to protecting and advocating for our country's infrastructure. My name is Jared Perdue. I currently serve as the Secretary for the Florida Department of Transportation. I'm a Florida native, a professional engineer, and have been a public servant with FDOT my entire 20-year career. Florida has one of the most diverse transportation portfolios in the country. FDOT's dedicated team oversees 12,000 miles of roadway, maintains over 7,000 bridges, and has nearly 7,500 miles of bicycle facilities. Florida is the only state with 4 large hub airports amongst its 19 commercial airports. Our 15 deepwater seaports are major contributors to America's supply chain, totaling 4.3 million TEUs in 2023, which is roughly 10% of the nation's total. Almost 3,000 miles of rail and our 48 transit systems keep our goods and people moving throughout Florida daily. Finally, Florida leads the nation as the fastest growing, most forward-facing state for space development. In 2023 alone, our Space Coast launched over 70 rockets. With our dynamic transportation system, expectations from our 22 million residents and 137 million annual visitors are higher than ever before. To help meet those expectations, FDOT has strong support from Governor DeSantis and our Florida legislature, with 76% of our budget coming from state funding, which means 24% of our budget is supported by federal funding. Federal dollars come from a combination of measures through IIJA, including discretionary grants. IIJA serves as a great example of increasing investment for infrastructure needs across our country. However, pieces of IIJA are hampering state flexibility and slowing the delivery of infrastructure to our communities, specifically through its emphasis on competitive discretionary grant funding over formula funding. Under traditional formula funding, states rely on their calculated apportionment to plan, program, and deliver projects for their communities. Historically, states have received 90% of total surface transportation apportionments in formula funds. Under IIJA, however, approximately 15% of funding is now being directed to discretionary grant programs, adversely impacting states who should be receiving more funding based on population, lane miles, land mass, or vehicle miles traveled. Florida's $500 million in discretionary grant awards equate to only 1.04% of the funding available for discretionary grants. Of the formula funding, Florida receives nearly 5% of the apportionment total under IIJA. As a growing state facing dynamic population and economic growth, Florida would be better positioned to meet emerging transportation needs through long-established formula programs. If IIJA funding made 90% available in formula funds instead of discretionary grant funding, Florida would receive an additional $2 billion over the 5 years of the Act. Since the inception of IIJA, FDOT has set aside resources totaling over $430 million in the pursuit of discretionary grant funding at one time or another. While waiting for an award announcement, this money was not building infrastructure. Instead, it was waiting to learn if we would be selected. It's also worth noting that a single quality application cost approximately $150,000 in fees and staff hours to develop. To date, FDOT's total approximate expenditure in application preparation is more than $5.5 million. I cannot imagine how difficult it is for smaller state agencies, local governments, and especially fiscally constrained rural municipalities to apply for these grants. For these communities, the status quo seems untenable. In summary, the current discretionary grant process creates burdens for transportation providers, arbitrarily picks winners and losers, and prioritizes political ideologies over physical infrastructure. Formula allocation of funds is more efficient and allows states to actually deliver infrastructure that is specific to their needs and supported by their communities. FDOT encourages Congress to lay the groundwork for a transportation authorization that revives stronger formula funding, encourages USDOT to operate efficiently, not bureaucratically, rejects the politicization of our nation's highways, and continues to appropriately increase overall funding for robust transportation infrastructure across the country. Our industry is the literal foundation for America's continued growth and success. Thank you again for the tremendous opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you again to all of our witnesses, and I'll now open it up for questions, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes for the first question. So and it goes to Commissioner Winders. I know you recently applied for a RAISE grant, $25 million RAISE grant for Highway 54 in Missouri. I'm curious, or can you talk a little bit about the challenges that you had and the obviously the benefits of that particular project?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, thank you. The project itself is taking a two-lane highway, Highway 54, and creating a shared four-lane, which if you're not familiar with that, it's effectively passing lanes every so often. The completion, doing this project would also complete a shortcut around between the Avenue of the Saints and Interstate 70. The shortcut's half done, but we need to do, this project would be the rest of it. We've been unsuccessful in 6 years in applying for RAISE grants. Our grant application has dropped over the years, actually every year. The first time we applied, we were highly recommended, and then we went to recommended, and now I believe the latest iteration was acceptable. And this is with effectively the same application. What has changed are the raters and rating criteria. Effectively, it's been, for us, our experience has been, it's been a moving target. The first, when we were, I believe when we were highly highly rated, we needed to do a benefit cost analysis, which was a $15,000 bill, and for a small coalition, that was a little bit difficult for us. But after our application was rated highly, one of the things we needed to change was have that benefit cost analysis. So we put together the money and did that, and then the next year we were not highly rated. We were recommended. So it's been items that in areas that have to do with the reviewer or the rating criteria that has changed, that's made our application less favorably looked upon. The other thing that happens is, as additional rating criteria have come into being, a county with a road project with clean air, and it just being a road project, environmental issues, clean air issues, and innovation, we just don't get a lot of points for that. In spite of the fact, and now I'll talk a little bit about the benefits of the highway. That particular road shares traffic with everything from horse and buggy Amish traffic at 3 or 4 miles an hour to 60 miles an hour heavy truck traffic, 20 mile an hour combines that are 16 or thereabouts wide, and every vehicle in between. Passing lanes would be a great safety improvement for that part of and a very much needed safety improvement. We just have been unable to make that case in the raised grant application. In addition to that, it's an unfinished project. I mentioned that this 4-lane is halfway done between 70 and the Avenue of the Saints. Completing this section would allow effectively a shortcut or a bypass on the northeast part of St. Louis, which should help congestion in the I-70, the Wentzville, where the Avenue of the Saints crosses Interstate 70. So we think it would be a really good improvement for the state and national system as well. Finally, it's an unfinished project. I mean, a couple of decades ago, the federal government in conjunction with the state, did the 4-lane up to halfway through the project to Mexico, Missouri, and then it stops. So completing this section is actually, I believe, the completion of some vision from decades ago that was positive in terms of how transportation can work to move people and goods in our area and nationally. It's not the only unfinished project, so I assume there might be others like us that will also have trouble with getting through the rating criteria. One example might be a bypass in Hannibal, in Marion County. The Avenue of the Saints goes mostly, you can go from Waterloo, Iowa, almost to St. Paul, all the way to New Orleans, and there's 7 stop signs on that route. The rest of it's 4-lane, and those 7 stop signs are in Hannibal. That bypass we're talking about a completion of the project. If we have these problems, I assume that other places do. Other places do as well, other counties do as well. We simply don't have the capacity, in spite of the fact that we have the best transportation planner at our Council of Governments. Her name is Anna Gill, and she's with us here today. We have the best transportation planner in the state. We just don't have the financial and human capacity to compete with the larger projects. So I apologize, Mr. Chairman, if that was long-winded, but that's kind of the story of the 54 Coalition.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a great intro for a question for Ms. O'Leary, because I wanted to ask you from a regional planner perspective. One, if we had more direct allocation of formula funding to local governments or targeted competitive grants open in counties, cities, or MPOs, would that be an improvement? If so, how would it be an improvement? And then the second, answer that one first.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Yes, I think that would be an improvement in certain areas where we have the expertise at the MPO level or at the local government level, and I think the Safe Streets for All is a really good example of that. We, at the MPO level across the country, have safety plans that can identify exactly the types of projects that need to happen. And then we work with our counties and our local governments, and some of them have even more in-depth safety plans done and ready to go. So in that case where the projects are really on the ground and local, I think it makes sense to be able to pass the funds through at that level.
Yeah, so on that point, so in my district, I got Puget Sound Regional Council, which is the kind of the urban planning bit. Then I have Skagit Council of Governments and Whatcom Council of Governments up near the border, much more rural areas. And I got Island County, which is its own thing as well, very much its own thing. And I would suggest there's a variety of technical capacity in each of those as well, although probably better than, say, any one of the smaller cities that currently exist. So do you have some thoughts about the technical capacity support that's come through the USDOT?
Right. So I think that MPOs provide and regions provide a lot of opportunity to provide capacity to local communities, especially smaller ones that don't necessarily have that knowledge or technical ability to do so. And that's one of the things that we've been able to do at SEMCOG. But you're right, we are a staff at SEMCOG of 70 staff being able to do that, whereas some of the smaller regions and MPO in the state may have 2 or 3 staff. So the ability to provide regions some of that technical support and dollars to be able to gear up to provide that assistance to local communities, I think would be very helpful. I think the federal programs to provide technical support are so important, but sometimes they don't necessarily know the issues like we do at the local level and being able to work directly with the local community.
Right. Mr. Baker, in the next authorization, we'll need to tackle how to get predictable funding for rail. Do you have an answer about how to do that?
Well, I guess cutting to the end of the answer, I don't know if you'll consider this an answer to how, but the advance appropriations from IIJA were just a real game changer for rail, which I think you referenced in your opening statement. That's been just a massive deal. Rail has never had that before for short lines, applying for CRISI, knowing that CRISI will be well-funded every year in advance is a huge deal and makes it something, frankly, you can count on and think about long-term business and growth for, as opposed to something that's subject to the vagaries of the process. Congress just sort of magically did that last time in the infrastructure bill.
We're that good.
And so if that's how it happens again, that would be okay with us.
Okay. All right. So thinking through the discretionary versus the formula, I appreciate Secretary Padu's your comment about having more formula. Roger Millar from my state wants that too. I've never ran into a state DOT director who didn't want more formula money. But the flip side is that either there's more money overall, or with the money that we authorize, then there's going to be some split. And we did a lot more competitive grant programs in this version because there was a need to do that. I can think of one particular need in our state with culvert removal, as a for instance. So there's just going to be this continual trade-off. But then we also have a process in our state. By the way, we're better than Florida. 21% of our transportation budget was funded. So. In that regard, but there's always this trade-off, and we have a process between our legislature and our county governments and city governments using things like County Road Administration Board to get dollars from formula allocated into these distribution mechanisms. And so that's what we do. It can be done. It's kind of my point I made earlier on the testimony. And does Florida have something like that, or does it all go through the state legislature? And nothing wrong with yours or my state legislature, but sometimes it's the vagaries of the state legislature as well that dictates where the money goes.
Thank you, Ranking Member Larson, for that question. And yes, actually, there is a time-tested model in place. Actually, with traditional formula allocations of federal funds, we do have local programs. Florida is a very diverse state geographically. We have very rural communities. We have very urban communities. And we've actually, like through the Bridge Formula Program, we've replaced a lot of off-system local bridges in cases where local municipalities have the technical expertise and the staffing and manpower to manage federal programs. We're more like a pass-through, and we administer the funds to the locals. Then for rural communities that may not have the staffing or expertise, we actually go in and deliver those projects for those rural communities. So there's a time-tested model in place. I think there is a very good way for formula distributed allocations to be utilized to help local communities.
All right, well, just before you go back, when I came on the committee in 2001, we argued about donor and donee states and tried to get a formula change, and this is just your testimony and testimony from Roger Millar, and he's great. It is just a version of that donor versus donee thing that someday it'll be perfect. Yeah, thanks. Go back.
Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While we're here today to discuss the Department's administration of grant programs, I'd be remiss if I didn't raise my continued concern with the Federal Highway Administration's final rule to require greenhouse gas performance measure, forcing state DOTs and MPOs to set declining targets for carbon dioxide emissions stemming from transportation on the national highway system. As I previously discussed in this committee, this rule exceeds the administration's statutory authority. This policy was considered and rejected as part of the Senate negotiations of IJA. So Secretary Perdue, does Florida DOT, do you agree with the rule that the rule goes beyond the administration's statutory authority?
Thank you, Congressman. And yes, absolutely, we do agree that it does go beyond the authority granted to FHWA, which is one of the reasons we joined 20 other states in a lawsuit challenging that rule. And, you know, our mission at FDOT is to deliver transportation infrastructure that moves people and goods safely and efficiently. I think the last thing that Floridians want FDOT to be doing is tracking and monitoring tailpipe emissions when they choose to drive a car.
So how will this rule impact the ability of state DOTs to make their own project selections?
This rule could have a significant impact. We actually have 27 MPOs in the state of Florida, so the rule not only requires DOT to set targets and track, but also those local MPOs. And so it's a tremendous effort to ramp that up and, you know, figure out like where are the different targets going to be, how are they going to be set up, what is it going to look like. There's just a lot of unknowns, and it's just very burdensome.
Let me shift gears just a little bit. As you know, Secretary Perdue, I just significantly expanded discretionary grant opportunities, and there's a process conducted before the end of each fiscal year known as August redistribution, in which outstanding obligation limitation for non-formula programs is redistributed to state DOTs. The total amount considered as part of this process has escalated over the past several years, and more specifically grown significantly since enactment of IJA. Federal Highways has projected the balance could reach $8.5 billion this year. The American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, or AASHTO, recently wrote to congressional leaders to raise this issue and encourage action. I appreciate the concerns of state DOTs, which are left scrambling to absorb this funding on a short timeline to ensure it does not lapse. Is this something you at Florida DOT are concerned about?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. It is actually a major concern and a huge challenge. Redistribution happens in August every year, and basically what happens is at the federal level, the discretionary funds and the TIFIA funds that have not been utilized or obligated are then redistributed to the states, and we're asked to take additional funds at the 11th hour of building our programs in the form of formula distribution. So the discretionary funds that are not moving are then being redistributed to us as formula, but that reduces, over the life of the authorization, that reduces our actual formula allocation balance. The allocation for the discretionary grant program still stays at what it is, and I would highlight that we're over halfway through the IJ authorization, and only around 30% of grants have been awarded at this time. A lot less than that has actually been authorized and obligated. So that redistribution amount continues to grow. We as a state are being asked to take more and more and more, and all that does is draw down on the formula funds that we can actually spend in the future.
Any thoughts on how we might fix this problem?
There's a few opportunities and a few ways to fix the problem, but you know, one thing that I would definitely highlight here is that obviously if the authorization could direct more resources to formula programs as opposed to discretionary grants, that would be great. Another potential solution is when redistribution happens, if those redistributed funds could add to our overall allocation of formula funds, and at the same time reduce the overall authorization for the discretionary grant programs, I think it would be a more predictable and manageable and consistent way going into the future.
Thank you. Appreciate you being here. Yield back.
Ms. Norton.
Ms. O'Leary, while most highway formula funds go to states, metropolitan regions receive dedicated formula funds through the Surface Transportation Program, the Transportation Alternatives Program, and the Carbon Reduction Program through a process known as sub-allocation. Can you speak to the benefits for the communities you serve in having dedicated, predictable funding streams for your region?
Thank you for that question. Yes, SEMCOG and a lot of the larger MPOs across the country do have sub-allocation of the Transportation Alternatives Program and the new Carbon Reduction Program. One of the reasons that I think that works really well, so in our region for TAP, as we call it, we receive about $10 million a year. What's nice about it being formula funds is that there is consistency, that we know we'll be receiving $10 million every year from this program, so we can look forward at projects that might not quite be ready this year, but they can get in the pipeline. We have a group of elected officials at our organization that actually makes all the funding decisions that we have. So we, as staff, take all the applications for the TAP funds and for carbon reduction. We vet them ourselves from the technical standpoint, but then we take them to our regional review committee of elected officials that represent fairly our entire region to make the final decisions about which funds happen for TAP and for carbon reduction. Both have been highly successful in our region for that way and very equitably distributed.
Ms. O'Leary, another question for you. This committee often talks about the role that highway infrastructure can play in promoting economic development. But that's not always the case. Your testimony cites Interstate 696 as, and here I'm quoting you, a major barrier to accessibility and economic development, and discusses how predominantly Black neighborhoods are were raised in the 1960s to make room for Interstate 375 in Detroit. I helped create two programs, Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhood Access and Equity, to begin redressing some of these harms. Can you discuss how reimagining and rebuilding highway infrastructure can improve economic development?
Thank you for that question, yes. And thank you for starting those programs for us. I talked for a bit about the Reconnecting Communities project, and in the instance of the 696 cutting one of our communities in half and the ability of our citizens to be able to get across the freeway, to be able to go to their schools or go to their places of worship has been a challenge for them. And so being able to receive that spurs economic development, and it's a citizen's right to be able to go to their community centers and things that were across the freeway. So it's been a very exciting program. In the case of I-375, that is a very large program. So that's a $300 million reconstruction program. And while we would have loved to use Reconnecting Communities, that pot of money was a little bit smaller, so they went with the larger pot of money under infra to be able to fund over $100 million to look at raising the grade, because yes, 375 in the 1960s cut very prominent Black neighborhoods in half and destroyed commercial areas back in the 1960s. So this will raise it back to grade and slow it down and make it more pedestrian friendly. And at SEMCOG, one of the things we do is the travel modeling to make sure that the system can handle that the freeways, we work with our state DOT very closely and make sure that all of that can work so that when we bring things up to grade, it'll end up having an economic boom in our downtown, but also, more importantly, connect our citizens across that freeway.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Transportation and Insurance Committee. And an Infrastructure Committee. Let's continue. Let's go to the great state of Florida, where Dan Webster is recognized. Representative Webster, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Perdue, the drawn-out timeline for Merit and DOT during the grant obligation process, like the Port Infrastructure Development Program, so forth, forces recipients to adjust their scopes due to inflation. I think other pressures, too, would cause readjustment. Considering the Port Infrastructure Development Program as an example, what's the average time it takes DOT to complete a grant contract?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. And yes, I would say in the transportation industry specifically, we have seen year over year close to 20% increases in the cost of delivering projects. Currently, what we're seeing with discretionary grants under USDOT is that it's actually taking from 18 to 24 months to get from award announcement to actual execution of a grant agreement, which is when you can actually access the money. For an entity like a seaport, who is typically delivering infrastructure and financing it through a myriad of sources. One would be they utilize state funds from FDOT, they utilize their own funds, they utilize bonding, and they also rely on these federal grants. Having to wait 18 to 24 months to actually access the money puts them in a real bind with their capital plan, and they find themselves with having, the cost of the project having gone up and then having to readjust their programs and plans and potentially find different ways to finance the project.
Can you give an example of how we might be able to avoid those delays?
There's a few different opportunities. One suggestion that I could bring is, especially for entities and agencies that have been managing federal programs for many, many years. I mean, like FDOT, we deliver billions of dollars worth of infrastructure with federal funds on it. Instead of going through this lengthy kind of bureaucratic process of having to enter into a separate grant agreement for every single award, the funds could actually be distributed to those entities that are time-tested and proven and know how to manage federal funds and directly administer to those agencies to deliver the projects. That would speed things up significantly. The other suggestion would be just speed up the time it takes to execute a grant agreement. I mean, there's no reason it should take 18 to 24 months.
So as you know, the House, we didn't have much say in what went into the IIJA. Most of us were on the side that didn't even vote for the bill because of various reasons. But if we had a say in the final bill, we probably wouldn't have had so many discretionary grant programs. So the multi-year planning program is difficult, and we have to rely on discretionary grants, but we don't have to as much. And as we rewrite in the coming years, the IIJA, do you have any recommendations on why we might use more formula-driven programs?
I do, Congressman, and thank you. And I'm happy to be on this panel with a colleague from MPOs because they're very important. And just to give a little context, transportation infrastructure is not dreamt up overnight. It takes years to plan infrastructure projects out, and we work very closely with MPOs and local communities to develop those plans using data and science and growth models to plan what projects are going to be needed 20 years in the future. And once the project is conceived, we immediately begin working on the development process. And even NEPA alone, to administer federal funds, you have to go through the NEPA process. That process alone takes 3-4 years a lot of times. And so, the fact that we have discretionary grants available is great, but there's a lot of additional requirements in those grants that may not have been part of the considerations for that planning, and you can't just dream up a project overnight and change the direction you're going. And so, for instance, in the state of Florida, we have billions of dollars of infrastructure in the pipeline right now that was conceived by local communities that they're waiting for us to deliver. And the faster we can get our hands on that funding, the better it's going to be for that infrastructure. And so, like looking into the future, formula distribution, formula allocation is much more effective, and there's a lot of opportunities in that, and if local communities are the focus, I think that there is a way to use those formula distribution, those formula allocations to help those local communities as well. And in a lot of cases in Florida, like for our fiscally constrained local communities and those that are rural, they actually need state DOT's help to administer projects with federal funds. And so it's actually it's beneficial for our communities if those formula allocations, even the ones that are going directly to communities, come through state DOTs. You know, for those local communities that have the staffing and expertise to manage federal funds, we can be a pass-through and administer the funds to the locals. And for those that can't, we can step in and actually help them deliver those projects.
Thank you very much for your answer. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Representatives. Let's go to the great state of California, where Representative Garamendi is recognized. You are recognized. 5 minutes.
Good heavens, Mr. Chairman, such enthusiasm for an introduction. Thank you. I'm sitting here listening to this. You guys have never had it so good. The state of California has never had it so good. Cry me a river. There is a river of money flowing from the federal government to the states, both in formula as well as in grants. And what I hear is a lot of crying about, well, it isn't this, we should do that, we have to sign, we have to have a little bit more information, and they're not approving it quite as fast as they ought to. And by the way, Mr. Perdue, you're complaining that with the allocations, you're getting more money up front, and then later down the years in the future, you may not have as much because you're getting it now rather than late. Cry me a river, folks. The IIJA has provided more money for infrastructure of all kinds, including transportation, than ever before in the history of this government. So cry me a river. Yes, there are restrictions. There are formulas. Mr. Winters, you complain about not getting your thing because the criteria has changed. You didn't say one word about what was wrong with the criteria. That would be useful to us. If you don't like the criteria that's been written in the current law and implemented by the Department of Transportation, then tell us what's wrong with the criteria. And I suspect some of it is, well, the criteria has changed. We're going to worry about communities that have been divided and destroyed by previous infrastructure. And we want to address that. You guys got a problem with that? Yes or no? Mr. Winters? Problem with that policy? Good. Mr. Baker? Policies with that policy?
No.
How about Ms. O'Leary?
No.
Mr. Perdue?
Thank you, Congressman.
Yes or no?
The increased funding is...
No, the policy question is, should we be allocating money by grants to communities that have been destroyed by previous infrastructure projects?
I would say it's much more efficient and effective to allocate money by formula distribution.
All right. Then you want to do away with all the grants, including the $15 million that Florida received for high-speed rail. Got it. We'll just eliminate high-speed rail grant program for Florida. And by the way, your ports receive mostly grant programs. You want to do away with that also? We could do away with that. Bottom line is, we have a situation here where this Congress, the previous Congress, not this one, the previous Congress authorized and appropriated more money than ever for formula as well as for discretionary grants. I understand. None of us get everything we want. And certainly we don't get everything I want for my district. But I do know that the opportunity to get it exists today. So just a couple of questions. Mr. Perdue, Florida reduced its gas tax to zero, gasoline tax to zero in 2022. Is that correct?
No, that is not correct.
And was there a reduction in the gasoline tax in Florida in 2022?
Not to my knowledge.
I believe your governor signed a bill that did that. But you know better than I suppose. I just found that the utility of this hearing would be, what is the specific questions that you have about the discretionary funding mechanisms and formulas. The criteria, what is wrong with the criteria that's out there? I gave one example. Are there other examples of criteria that you think are incorrect? I think you can provide that to us in writing. I will also note that we're sitting here with the IIJA providing more money than ever before for all kinds of infrastructure, including transportation. And there were 13 of my Republican colleagues that voted for it. Only 4 of them still are in Congress, but they're happy to vote no and take the dough. So the question for us as we go forward is, if you don't like the formula, if you don't like the discretionary allocation, what is wrong with it? The fact of the matter is that the Department of Transportation has pushed out a vast amount of money through both formula as well as discretionary funding. So please deliver to us in the days ahead what of those criteria in the discretionary funding that you find inappropriate. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the Lone Star State, great state of Texas, where Dr. Babin, Representative Babin, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you, witnesses, for being here as well. I represent the 36th District of Texas, home to some of our most critical ports in the nation and waterways and really more refineries and petrochemical plants than anywhere else in the country. Rail, highway infrastructure, manufacturing, industrial sector facilities. And I'm very pleased we're having this hearing to discuss these issues and opportunities related to competitive discretionary funding from DOT. My first question is for all of the panelists. If you would give a very brief answer, I would appreciate it. In conversations with the Texas Department of Transportation, or TxDOT, I've heard that the U.S. Department of Transportation conducts debriefs with grant applications that were not selected. And I've also heard that these debriefs are not transparent whatsoever. Applicants aren't allowed to seek additional information or even see the scoring sheets or speak to those who scored the applications. What is your experience with these debriefs, and what do you think could be changed to make them more beneficial and transparent? Please.
For short line railroads, anyone who doesn't win Chrissy Grant typically does request a debrief, and they get them. We do appreciate the opportunity. I would agree with the premise of the question, though. The whole process could be more transparent, yes. Frankly. We would love to see much more public information about who applies, who doesn't win, exactly, for the ones that do win, exactly what was in the application, where it stands, how it's progressing. I think sunshine would be a tremendous benefit for the whole process.
It's amazing how sunlight can help things. Anybody else?
We would agree. I believe that the debrief process is helpful, can be helpful. In our particular circumstance, it affected what we did. We went and got the benefit cost analysis, but it didn't help us. So not knowing necessarily what everything about the criteria and especially how it would be rated the next year would have been helpful.
Okay, thank you. Nobody else? Okay. Another question for all of you, if anyone feel free to chime in briefly. Many local governments receiving grant funds do not realize that the money is provided on a reimbursable basis, which can be very critical to a small city. I was a small city mayor myself. Is the DOT doing a good job of letting locals know that? What should DOT do to ensure that this is understood so that locals can consider this in their decision-making process? Who would like to answer that one?
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. Absolutely, I can provide a little insight on that. Some of them, I would say, some of your more progressed that have staffing and expertise are aware of that. Others, a lot of rural communities, underserved communities may not be aware of that, and it can be a real challenge. And I mentioned in my testimony the the demand on resources just simply to pursue grants and also even provide the matching requirements. This is one of the challenges with discretionary grants programs. At Florida DOT, we actually had to set up an entire team to support our local governments and local communities, especially as they're staring in the face the potential opportunity to directly receive federal grant monies. It is very cumbersome, very difficult, very challenging to manage projects with federal dollars on them, and there's a lot of requirements and rules you have to meet, and it takes a lot of expertise to do that. And so, you know, it is taking a lot of assistance from FDOT in support of those local communities, and it can really be a challenge.
Okay, thank you very much. The last question is for you, Mr. Secretary Perdue. As you know, it's important that state DOTs maintain awareness of projects on their own system to ensure coordination with local partners and the appropriate project planning that must go forth. Are you finding that U.S. Department of Transportation is awarding funds to transportation partners in your state on projects that are on the state system without notifying you? Any examples you'd like to share?
Thank you, Congressman. I don't have any specific examples. We did identify this as a major risk early on, which is one of the reasons we established our team. The risk is there, the opportunity for that to happen is there, and so, you know, we've kind of set up a process internal to FDOT to have consistent, you know, frequent communications with those local communities that are pursuing grants. And we've even offered, you know, our support in terms of the grants they're pursuing, just so that we will have that awareness, because that is a potential risk.
Okay, thank you, and I'm going to yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Dr. Babin. Let's go to the great state of Nevada. Representative Titus, you are recognized. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you very much. I just wanted to point out that the grant monies that have come from the bipartisan infrastructure law have really helped Southern Nevada recover, and they have been coming pretty rapidly, and we appreciate that. You may have heard about the $3 billion that we got as part of building a super speed train from Las Vegas to Los Angeles, which will certainly help with our tourism economy. And another program that we've gotten a considerable funding, $13.3 million, is for Safe Streets and Roads for All. And Ms. O'Leary, you mentioned in your testimony that your area has a similar program, and you suggested that it transition from discretionary to formula funding. Would you elaborate on that and tell us why that would make such a difference, and what a problem it might be if this whole program went away?
Right. Well, thank you for noticing that in the testimony.
Mm-hmm.
We see, when I mentioned the buckets of discretionary funds, one of the buckets was for kind of new challenges, and safety isn't a new challenge, but post-pandemic and during the pandemic, it became a challenge again with fatalities. We were seeing a trend of it going down, and suddenly, during the pandemic, it started going up, and post-pandemic, it continues to go up. So I think noticing that and then saying, okay, that is a challenge, and having discretionary funds to be able to address it is vital. But it's not going away. We wondered if it was a blip during COVID that then we would see it start going back down again, and we haven't. So that's what makes me think this is a problem that is across the country, not in just Michigan, right, and not just in Nevada. We've got it everywhere. And that's where it does seem to make sense to me that in the next round that we talk about it being more formula, because it does impact everyone across the country. And again, you know, locally derived solutions is really making a game changer.
Well, thank you. You know, when you provide safety for all the different users of the road, it's not only good for those users, but it gets more people perhaps out of cars and on bicycles or mass transit or just walking to the store, whatever it might be. But we got to be sure those streets are safe for all those users. So thank you. I'd like to consider making that change next time.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then I would just ask all of you this question. Mr. Yackham and I introduced a bill called Invest in Our Communities Act, and it was about promoting economic development. One of the things we looked at is capacity building. Small towns, rural areas don't have the same resources to apply for certain grants, and we wanted to see about building that in. I wonder if some of you would comment on how that might make a difference. Is it needed? Should we look at that in the next transportation authorization bill as we consider different grant programs?
I believe we would appreciate and support anything that would provide technical assistance to rural communities and counties as it relates to navigating through the grant processes, the notices of federal funding, and compliance with the rules. So I believe that we would support that.
There are some small short line railroads that would make some of those small towns and counties look like major metropolises by comparison. So I'm not sure if the bill applies to small businesses, but in general, we would welcome any sort of help applying. These programs can be very challenging, and it just looks like Mount Everest of bureaucracy if you're a small business trying to conquer this.
And sometimes in small governments or rural areas, it's, well, here, you're not busy, write us up a grant proposal. And that's just not going to be competitive today. We need that expertise and those resources. Anybody else want to comment?
I would just add, I think it's a great idea. One of the things we've noted is that with the grant opportunities, it would be, we talked just about that. It would be nice if there was some capacity building built right into it. So I think that's a really great idea. I would say it is rural areas, but it's also our small urban cities. So while some of our large urban cities have more staff and more capacity, some of our small urban cities, they're very limited in staff and the ability to write these grants as well. We formed a committee at SEMCOG of just those mayors to come together, and we actually have a meeting tomorrow to talk about what their issues are, and then one of the number one things they say is their ability to write these grants and the capacity building that they need. And they're very urban communities, they're just very small.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, then I yield back.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the great state of North Carolina, where Representative Rouser is recognized. Representative Rouser, good morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Perdue, in your testimony, you state that your department was awarded a RAISE grant in 2021, but the U.S. Department of Transportation has not yet finalized that grant agreement. In fact, you mentioned how grant delivery can often take 18 to 24 months to be dispersed. Consequently, the time funding for these projects, by the time funding for these projects is delivered, they're already in the red. So that's been the experience in North Carolina as well. In October 2022, the North Carolina Department of Transportation was awarded an infra grant to widen 10 miles of the I-85 Futures Corridor. This grant has been pending for more than 18 months. At the time of the application submittal, the estimated cost was $640 million. In June 2023, the project was set to cost $720 million. By November of 2023, the project was at $839 million, meaning a total increase of at least $200 million. $200 million. In August 2022, the department was awarded a RAISE grant to reconstruct 28 bridges in several counties across North Carolina. And this grant agreement with the Federal Highway Administration has still not been finalized. And while it may be somewhat of a complex project, that's inexcusable. So, one aspect of this grant debate that we've not really dived into are the cost overruns. Can you talk about your experience in Florida with regard to that?
Thank you, Congressman. And what you're describing that North Carolina DOT is dealing with is the same that every public transportation provider is dealing with. Especially over the last 3 years, nationwide, the economy's been volatile. The cost of doing business has continued to increase. We've seen in some regions increases as much of 20 to 30% year over year. If you look at the discretionary grant process as a whole, from the time you decide to pursue a grant to the time that you actually are able to access the funds to build the project, you're looking at potentially 3 years. This is not an efficient, effective way to deliver infrastructure. And I'll just go back again to my statements about formula allocation. When we receive the formula allocation in those funds, regardless of what programs they're for, they can go directly on projects and be put to work immediately. So this is a tremendous challenge. I've already heard from several transportation entities in Florida that are considering not pursuing federal grants because of the financial liability and financial risk with having to wait so long to actually access the money.
Yeah, so the bottom line is you can fund something all you want to fund it, but if you don't have a good, quick pathway to get the money there and get it delivered, what does that mean? You know, it's just a lot of extra cost, a lot of extra burden, and last time I checked, money is a scarce resource. It's not infinite. The North Carolina Department of Transportation has found that the new multi-step application process for the Bridge Investment Program to be somewhat helpful. Specifically, this program now gives applicants a period of time for dialogue to address initial feedback from the U.S. Department of Transportation before a final decision is made. The North Carolina Department of Transportation recently applied, in fact, for a Bridge Investment Program grant for the Cape Fear Memorial Bridge Replacement Project in Wilmington, North Carolina, is going through this process. Has your department benefited from this program at all, this process?
Thank you, Congressman. Actually, no, we've not benefited from it. We've applied for 3 projects in the Bridge Investment Program. One of them is known as DuPont Bridge in Bay County, Florida. It serves actually a major Air Force base that's going through a tremendously huge rebuild after Hurricane Michael. Is also in need of capacity improvements and is also deficient in time to be replaced. We were not successful in getting that award. The feedback we received was really not transparent, was inconsistent, incoherent. We're not really sure why it was not a good candidate, but we had to go ahead and fund the project anyways because we have to deliver this major bridge project for the Air Force Base. And secondly, we submitted one in the Florida Keys, a Long Key Bridge, and we were not successful for that one either, which, as you know, there's only one way in and out of the Keys, so that bridge project is extremely important for hurricane evacuation.
Yeah, absolutely. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Up next is the great state of California. Representative Carbajal, you are recognized. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The bipartisan infrastructure law, also referred to as bill, one of a few names that people give it, provided an extraordinary amount of competitive grant funding through the 72 programs. The Department of Transportation has issued nearly 90 notices of funding opportunity to distribute this funding. However, in recent meetings with MPOs, counties, and cities in my district, I know there are challenges for local governments to compete for grant funding. Two-part question, Mr. Winters. From your perspective, do you agree that Congress should continue to provide infrastructure funding directly to local governments? And 2, if the multitude of competitive grants under the bill poses challenges, what are your recommendations to build local capacity and make it easier for local governments to succeed as we begin to turn our attention to our next surface reauthorization bill?
Thank you, Representative, for that question. I believe that the position of the National Association of Counties is clear, that we would like to see this level of investment in our nation's infrastructure continue. So hopefully that's the answer to your first part. The second part of your second question is a little more difficult. We do need to we do need to find ways and would support ways that our federal partners could help us gain capacity to be able to go through notices of funding, of federal opportunity, and to navigate the things that have to be done, the laws and regulations when a grant is awarded. But even before you, so we would appreciate that and support that. But in addition to that, we would support the concepts of making things more simple and making the objectives clear. What is it that we're trying to do, and how the process will and how the applications will be rated. We're absolutely in support of local flexibility, which could mean direct funding for counties in terms of infrastructure. We also support the removal of barriers into the project. And you identified one that we've also identified, which is critical, and that is capacity, financial and technical capacity. So So I just want to touch a little bit more about objectives. If the objective is to build a road, and of course that's what I'm talking about, we want to build a road. I don't know how we're going to affect air quality. I don't know how we will meet some of the other rating criteria, which is not to say that they're not important, which is not to say that we don't value clean air, which is to say we can't write an application, or I don't know how we can write an application that will compete with places that have that issue and issues like those. So clear, single-minded grants to do specific things with specific goals in mind, we would support. That was kind of a long answer.
Thank you. Having served in local government as a county supervisor and working with the National Association of Counties, while we appreciate our state partners, it's always nice when funding could be directed to local governments. And I think that's always been advocacy for many of local governments throughout our country and certainly in the state of California and my region. Mr. Baker, in 2015, Congress created the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement, CRISI program. The bipartisan infrastructure law provided $5 billion in federal funds for the CRISI grant program to help support short line and passenger rail projects. How has this program been beneficial to your industry and the public?
Thank you. CRISI, essentially my entire testimony focused on CRISI. It's a huge, huge deal for short lines. It's allowing us to rehabilitate and preserve lines that otherwise would be at risk of abandonment. And short lines, without boring people with the origin story of short lines, but they essentially exist to preserve lines that otherwise would go away, typically serving small towns, rural areas, disadvantaged areas, some small ports. And it's very expensive infrastructure, but frankly, the reason it's a short line in the first place is because it doesn't have enough traffic to be a Class 1. It's just not busy enough. And so we do our very best to run lean and scrounge every penny we can. But if we're going to maintain expensive infrastructure and rebuild bridges and do it all safely, sometimes we need some government help. And the government, luckily, has been supportive of short lines for a long time. And this new level of CRISI has taken it even to a higher level. So we're extremely appreciative.
Thank you very much. I'm out of time. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. Let's head north to the great state of Minnesota, where Representative Stauber, you are recognized. Good morning.
Thank you very much. And to my colleague, Representative Carbajal, being a former county commissioner, you were speaking the same language. I appreciate you. Smaller governments often face difficulties when applying for federal grant dollars due to the complex, time-consuming, and expensive process. Larger cities with bigger budgets can hire grant writers and lobbyists to apply for federal grants, giving them an advantage in the overall process. Mr. Winters, I looked at your history, read your testimony. You have been a great public servant for a long time. We need more of you. That's all I can say. But I do have some questions. What has been your experience in applying for DOT competitive grants from a cost and resource standpoint?
It has been difficult. Thank you for the compliment, Representative. I appreciate that very much. It has been difficult for us to keep the resources together to put together an application. Obviously, we have not been successful in putting the right resources into our application or answering the questions correctly, or, and this is what I think is the case, the rating criteria just don't match up with rural Missouri, rural America, so the competitive field is tilted away from rural America. We are very fortunate in that we have a great regional planning commission, very dedicated staff.
Which you led several years back.
That may be true. But they're still limited. We have 8 counties, something under about 100,000 people, and 5 staff members. So our experience, I think, is not unique in rural America. Those folks do a great job with the limited resources they have, but when it comes to writing a grant application that's competitive, it's difficult.
A couple things here. So would you agree that the process is not easily understood and not simple to use?
I would 100% agree with that, Representative.
Yeah. So rural communities are at a disadvantage, I agree, in applying for these grants. And one of my great frustrations with the IIJA was that it was drafted without the input of a single Republican member of Congress. My constituents were not given a seat at the table, and it is evident in the legislation. For example, the Rural Surface Transportation Grant. This grant was created through IIJA as a carve-out for rural communities. I want to emphasize rural communities. Unfortunately, there was an oversight in drafting, as the definition in statute for rural is, as you know, 200,000 people or less. That's the definition of rural that was in the IIJA. There are 855 cities in Minnesota. 796 cities have populations of under 20,000. So under this current definition in the IIJA, those that would qualify for rural roads would be everybody in the state of Minnesota with the exception of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So that means our northern communities with 3,000 people are fighting the suburbs of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so we could have, had it gone through regular order, we would have caught that and changed that definition. Now we're trying to backtrack it with legislation to change it. And it's very frustrating. At the end of the day, I'm looking at ways to make the grant process more accessible to not only my district, which is rural Minnesota, but across America in your district as well. I have helped introduce the Rebuilding Rural Roads Act, which Congressman Finstad from southern Minnesota and I lead. It strikes the $200,000 people in the Rural Surface Transportation Grant and inserts 20,000 in its place. And I also have co-sponsored the Simplifying Grants Act, which would require government agencies to simplify the difficult process for all current and future federal grant opportunities. Not 150 pages, 20 pages. I just want to thank you all for being here. And just real quick in my 30 seconds, the short line, Mr. Baker, the short lines are so important, as you know, in northeastern Minnesota. With the mining, we have an awesome opportunity. And, I think that as we look at the opportunities for economic development, and particularly in northeastern Minnesota, and our mining industry, we have to really ensure that the railroads are properly maintained. And I can tell you that the safety is as important to the constituents as it is to you. And we have a good working relationship in northeastern Minnesota, and we appreciate that. Safety is the number one, number two, and number three priority. Mr. Winters, again, thank you for your service, and county government is so precious. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative. Let's go to the land of Lincoln, the great state of Illinois, where Representative Garcia is ready to go. Good morning. You're recognized. Representative Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, for this hearing, and to all the witnesses who have joined us. I'd like to begin by offering a statement for the record from the Cook County Department of Transportation and Highways. I ask unanimous consent to include the statement in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Chairman. In my district, Cook County Department of Transportation and Highways has done an excellent job at leveraging discretionary grants from the IIJA at the local level. The Invest in Cook program makes up to $8.5 million available annually to support planning, engineering, land acquisition, and construction of transportation projects. The Invest in Cook program provides assistance to projects that might otherwise stall because of a lack of a local match or local resources. In its first 7 years, the program has awarded $56 million to fund 243 projects. Question to Ms. O'Leary. Invest in Cook is a great example of how regional governments can play an important role in assisting local communities with grant applications, project data, and funding. This model has been effective for winning IIJA discretionary grants throughout my district. Your council seems to have found a similarly effective approach. Can we encourage standards and best practices to be more widely adopted so that more counties can leverage this funding, in your opinion?
Yes, thank you so much. I would like to say that building local capacity is really right up the alley of the MPOs and the regional governments that you mentioned as well, and the great program that you just described. That's exactly what we try to do at SEMCOG, and many of us across the country that are the MPOs or the Council of Governments do for our membership, is to be able to provide that capacity building, get people together, make sure they know about the grant opportunities, and help them figure out what's the right grant to apply for, what's the criteria, what is their chance of success, because it is expensive to apply, and we want to make sure that we're connecting all of the data and information that we have, and it sounds like your group is doing exactly the same thing. So I do think there's quite an opportunity there for other MPOs across the country to be able to do that as well.
Great, thank you, Ms. O'Leary. Your testimony also mentions the Safe Streets for All grant program and the need for this to become formula funding rather than discretionary. I know a couple of my colleagues have raised this issue. How would transitioning to formula funding for this program impact the amount of funds available for Justice 40 communities that need investments the most?
The reason we thought that it could evolve into a formula program is, one, that we mentioned, it really is an issue across the whole country. We are all struggling with this issue post-pandemic, and so formula funds would be helpful to be able to do that. But also, one of the benefits of formula funds is really understanding what you're going to receive for the most part every year and be able to line those projects up and work with our partners and our local governments over the years. And that's what we've successfully been able to do with our TAP program and our CMAQ and our carbon reduction programs, so that we're all working together and we know what to expect every year. And I think that's what we thought would be the benefit of moving it to a formula program.
So the certainty and the predictability
Absolutely.
would be a big asset to you all. Well, thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I now will take us to the free state of Florida, where I recognize myself for just a brief series of questions. You're doing great. Mr. Secretary, what an honor it is to have you also from the free state of Florida. Would you agree that Florida's on fire right now? Florida's population has just skyrocketed and continues to skyrocket every day. Would you agree with that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, not only is our population skyrocketing, but also the number of people that visit Florida is skyrocketing.
Very good. And that, not only are they building houses and condos and residential units, we need roads, and we need those roads that have already been there repaired. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement.
And it is a challenge. You do have to do it smarter, faster than everybody else to keep up. Would you also say that some would argue Florida doesn't get its fair share of transportation dollars? Is that a fair statement? Could you argue that?
That is definitely a fair statement in terms of discretionary grant distribution.
Very good. Speaking of discretionary, some would say that we should do away with them because transportation departments don't work with local governments. Is that true? And how do we do it in Florida?
That is 100% inaccurate, and thank you for bringing that up. Actually, local governments and local communities are really the heart and soul of every single transportation project, regardless if it's a road project, a transit project, seaport, airport. Transportation infrastructure goes through an extensive process of grassroots planning at the local community level. As a matter of fact, every transportation project that we deliver as a state DOT is conceived of and prioritized by the local community before we ever spend $1 on it.
That is the type of that's what we want to see. Members of Congress, I was, as you know, in the Florida Senate for 10 years. We put our money where our mouth is because we didn't get, we think, our share. And so, but it demands it. Those roads have to be built, have to be maintained. But the only way to do it is, as you said, is the coordination with local governments. We're all in it together. So Florida is just, everybody's coming to Florida. Maybe there's a state law that when you were in the Northeast, if you turn 70, you have to move to Florida. That's the way that's a joke. That's not really what happens, but it seems like it does. So how do you do? I know there's an initiative moving Florida forward. Would you talk about that? Maybe other states are listening of how to get it done.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And having been in the state legislature, you know, we have a very solid history in Florida of our legislature continuously investing in transportation infrastructure. Governor DeSantis has been a tremendous leader in that. As a matter of fact, we have had record numbers of general revenue surplus, and it was through his initiative called Moving Florida Forward that the legislature invested another $4 billion of general revenue surplus into our already record work program, which was about $65 billion over 4 years. And so that's tremendous, and it's enabled us to move many major complex projects forward, like I-4 in Central Florida that a lot of people know, even if they don't live there, they know it. We've been able to move those projects forward in a time when it's very difficult to get our hands on federal funding through the discretionary process.
Is there a secret sauce to getting projects done on time and under budget?
It takes extensive work with local communities, generating that grassroots support, which is something that we have really learned to value at Florida DOT. Every single community is different. Every single community has its own character, its own vision. Making sure that the projects we deliver are aligned with their goals and their values and their vision for the future will speed it up like you've never seen.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. I now take us back to North Carolina, where Representative Fushi, you are recognized. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you. And thank you to the witnesses for being here with us today. We know that discretionary grants are a vital part of our funding infrastructure that make our infrastructure projects like roads and bridges and our transportation projects like rail lines and new buses possible. I am thankful for the Biden administration's work on expanding discretionary funding opportunities and glad to say that my district, NCO4, has received over $130 million in discretionary funding in recent fiscal years. The bipartisan infrastructure law appropriated billions of dollars for infrastructure programs, many of those dollars being available through competitive grant programs. Now that these funds are available, we must make sure that DOT has the resources necessary to administer them in a way that is accessible for our stakeholders. I look forward to hearing from you on the ways that you would like to see the discretionary grant process improved and how we can work together to ensure the process realizes its full potential. My first question is for anyone who would like to weigh in. I'd like to ask about notices of funding opportunity, or NOFOs, and the information provided to stakeholders when applying for these grants. What additional information or resources can DOT provide to improve the clarity of NOFOs or answer any questions stakeholders may have when applying? Not all at once.
Well, I think we've discussed that I think everyone here would welcome help building capacity, especially of smaller applicants who struggle to deal with the bureaucracy. But I do also think there's an opportunity for DOT to simplify the NOFOs. I don't know that making them ever more complex and then offering ever more resources to help people deal with ever more complexity is a productive way to view it, as much as it is. They could be much simpler. There could be standardized templates. They could be shorter. There's, I think, a big opportunity for DOT to get to the point quicker. It doesn't need to be a 40-page NOFO for a small applicant to access a small grant program.
Others? Well, my second question is for Ms. O'Leary. As the Executive Director of the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, I'm sure you've helped many local governments through the grant process. You alluded to some of those in your testimony. What are some of the top issues you see local governments experience when applying for discretionary funding, and what recommendations do you have for streamlining the application process through DOT?
I would say the top issues that we see are a lot of what's been spoken about, that one is connecting with the right grant. There's a lot of opportunities, so which grant fits with my project. And so we try to talk to them about, what are you really trying to achieve? What is your project, or what is the issue that you're having? And then some of us who have the knowledge of the grant programs could help connect them to the right grant to apply for. The second is really, as was spoken of, the cost to apply for the grants can be an impediment to some to be able to apply, especially if they don't have a grant writer on staff. The amount of money really varies depending on if it's a more small planning grant, could be $10,000 to $20,000. I'm seeing $40,000 with our Safe Streets for All application, but that was planning more related. And then, as you get into the raise, you have much more experience over here with what those costs would be. And then I think the match, that's a concern for people as well, especially as the projects get larger. The ability to match, especially in our underserved areas, is very difficult for them to be able to take it on and be able to do the match.
Thank you. I see my time is approaching. I yield back.
Now I recognize Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate your testimony, Secretary Perdue. I know a lot of folks were excited about the infrastructure bill and the suggestion that it was going to provide increased funds for things like roads and bridges. In my home state of Louisiana, we've seen where the assumption of an increase in funding has been more than consumed by the bureaucracy, by inflation, by supply chain, by labor. Are you seeing similar outcomes in Florida?
Yes, thank you, Congressman, and absolutely we are. As a matter of fact, if you look at the increase in the cost of doing business over the last 3 years, the actual increase of the formula distribution, IJ, was not even enough to fully cover the cost of inflation. It basically came just in the nick of time.
Thank you, and that's what we're seeing at home as well. Another question for you: your testimony was fascinating in that you indicated $150,000 in terms of the cost of applying for some of these discretionary grant programs. I want to make note, Mr. Chairman, you can buy a home for $150,000 in a lot of the communities that I represent in South Louisiana. It's an extraordinary cost, and you indicated the millions of dollars that cumulatively you have spent applying for discretionary grants, yet not seeing the outcomes or performance that you think is fair to the state of Florida. What do you attribute, one, the higher cost, and I know you talked about this a little bit, but one, the higher cost, and secondly, just the lack of performance of your grant applications compared to what you've seen historically?
Well, to start with, the lack of performance, I'm not really sure why we're not being awarded grants. I mean, we have world-class infrastructure in Florida, just like many other states. Quite honestly, it doesn't make sense. I mean, right now we're at 1% of grant awards. We have the third largest population in the nation, so it just doesn't make sense. Now, with discretionary grants, inherently there is an assumption that it's competitive, and so every entity pursuing grants wants to produce and submit the best possible application they can submit. This takes time. This takes resources. We're seeing the cost of preparing an application continue to increase, and I would say the more awards we don't receive, the more we try to figure out what more do we need to do to receive a grant, because we're just not real sure anymore, and it's becoming a real struggle. We don't get a lot of feedback on why we're not being awarded grants.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And in that regard, I used to run a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure program, and I know that certainty and predictability and clear criteria was always something that was very helpful to us. In this case, this administration has brought new criteria to the table, including under the auspices of Justice 40, which implicates over $200 billion in funds, effectively setting aside 40% of it for this criteria that I believe really distorts or provides a lack of clarity for criteria related to transportation. For example, some of the criteria that's brought to the table to determine where grants for transportation projects will be issued are things like climate change, racial equity, enhancing union opportunities, things that don't really have criteria that are traditionally applied to transportation projects. Have those criteria that, I'll say it again, it's not time saved in traffic, reduced emissions, safety improvements, things that are historically criteria that apply to transportation projects. Has that complicated your ability to figure out how to apply or how to compete for some of these discretionary grants?
Yes, it has, and you're exactly right. They've brought a lot of requirements to the table that are not directly connected to infrastructure that we're supposed to be building and delivering for the residents of Florida. And I'll go back to this statement. The infrastructure that's in the pipeline has been planned for the last 15 to 20 years by our local communities. They built models, they used data, they used science to determine what was going to be needed 15, 20 years in the future. What transportation providers find themselves doing are trying to figure out ways to take the infrastructure in the pipeline and shoehorn it back into these random requirements that are being included in NOFOs.
That's a very helpful, thank you. Mr. Winters, you noted that the complexity of complying with federal regulatory requirements is incredibly costly in terms of trying to advance projects that are a priority for you. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe the comparison of projects that you've built without federal funds, using state and local that don't trigger federal regulatory requirements as compared to those that do trigger federal regulatory requirements?
Yes, thank you for the question. The projects that we do with local county money, we are able to, the requirements are much less onerous. There are state requirements, of course, but we can budget and execute the projects. We build several bridges every year, and it's much quicker.
Last quick question. Do you trash the environment when you build projects without complying with federal requirements?
No, sir, we do not.
Didn't think so. Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes Skolton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses for being here today. Especially great to see a representative from my home state, the great state of Michigan. Ms. O'Leary, you spoke in your testimony about how the simplification of the grant application process would help make funds from key pieces of legislation such as the bipartisan infrastructure law more accessible to smaller and less resourced communities. As a member of both this committee and the Small Business Committee, I understand how many hurdles there are in these grant application processes. We actually hired a specific grants and outreach coordinator in our office just to help address a lot of these issues. What specific hurdles come to mind for you, and what would that process for simplifying the grant application look like to you?
Thank you. It's great to see you. Well, our local governments have a lot of issues relating to the applying for the grants. And I think one of the big problems is just really connecting what grants need to be applied for what projects. And having that guidance can be a challenge. And that's where regions are trying to play that role to really understand. You know, we play that role on a lot of things, whether we try to understand a grant program or understand a regulation. Our local governments are really busy running their government. And so we need to be able to play that role and say, okay, we as regional entities can talk to you about, here are the grant applications, here are the ones that would fit with what you want to get done. So that's one of the number one things I talk to them about is, what are the issues you're hearing? We brought together 35 to 40 mayors. They're meeting again tomorrow to talk about what are their issues in their community, and infrastructure was still the number one thing they said, both transportation and water infrastructure, and lack of capacity to be able to apply for the grants.
Yeah. Thank you. You also cite the importance of helping communities prepare for extreme weather events that are becoming more frequent with climate change. To that end, what could the Protect Discretionary Grant Program do for communities like those in Southeast Michigan experiencing extreme weather events like the August 2023 floods?
Thank you. Well, we're pretty excited about the Protect grant, both on the planning side. We are a regional planning agency, of course, but also on the implementation side. Being able to develop a transportation resiliency plan will actually lower the match for those that then apply for Protect implementation dollars, which is, you know, one reason to do it, right, is to be able to address the match issue for our communities. But what we've also seen is with the amount of rain and flooding disasters that we're having in our region, the infrastructure isn't going to handle that amount of rain. And we can't build ourselves out of it. We can't pull all the infrastructure out and put larger pipes everywhere. So what we're trying to do, which we think is pretty innovative, is looking at the Protect funds to figure out where in the region does it make sense to store large amounts of floodwater above ground using large-scale green infrastructure or other techniques, because our region and many urban areas are very complicated. You can't just put the water in one spot and think it's going to work. You have to understand how the sewer system and the stormwater system work together. And so we're excited about that opportunity to be able to identify actual locations that then can lead to implementation dollars.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We look forward to continuing to work with you on that as well. Using my last minute here to stay on the theme of water, in my district over in West Michigan, water is critically important. It's a way of life for all of us in Michigan. But the bipartisan infrastructure law's unprecedented in investment in communities is already being felt. Earlier this year, the EPA announced $177 million for Michigan drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure upgrades. Essential. I can think of places to put that just within Michigan 3. Everyone deserves access to clean water, but we know well in Michigan that aging infrastructure has not been replaced at the rate that it needs to, and can lead to really detrimental results. So if you can stay on that theme a little bit and speak to specifically for clean water, drinking water, how will this impact these funds, the state, going forward?
Well, we've done an analysis in our region where we need $3 billion a year for the next 20 years just to keep our infrastructure at a level of good service. So that's not even managing the amount of new rainfall that we're seeing in the region and the improvements that you need to see at a wastewater treatment plant. That's $3 billion a year just in Southeast Michigan. So it's a huge investment that's needed. And in our state, the lack of being able to do stormwater utilities is a real challenge. And so we're trying to address that at the state level. The program dollars through the bipartisan infrastructure law are unprecedented, but we need to remember a lot of those are loans, right? They go into the SRF program and they need to be paid back. And local governments sometimes don't have the ability to pay them back. So principal forgiveness is a big part of that.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Yield back.
The gentlewoman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is for Mr. Baker. The Department of Transportation seems to be increasingly requiring applicants focus on merit criteria. And this is like our president's climate, equity, and justice goals, and some of these are very woke. Would you say that these criteria are useful for evaluating funding for short-line rail and regional rail applicants? And do you think the Department of Transportation's grant application process is intuitive for applicants?
Well, answering the second question first, it's not intuitive. It's a big hurdle. I think we've talked a lot about that this morning already. For small applicants, particularly short lines who might be applying for one grant in the history of their company, it's a big hurdle to clear, and I think there's a lot of room for the process to be simplified, and I think that would be a ripe area for Congress to require in the next reauthorization. To answer your first question on the merit criteria, I would say a lot of that's not a real natural fit for a short line railroad application, kind of one way or the other, and you do have to bend yourself into pretzels a little bit trying to apply. I will say, to be fair, it hasn't been a huge hassle at the end of the day for short lines, and there are some aspects of short lines where we serve rural and disadvantaged areas, and they're small companies that are, and we're good for the environment, that are a reasonable fit. So we've learned to live with it, but it's not a natural fit.
Well, what would you recommend to the Department of Transportation, just point blank?
Thank you. I think there's a lot of room for improvement. I've hit on a few of them. I think for Chrissy in particular, there's an opportunity to focus that program more on freight rail, with passenger rail having access to sort of the other 58 of, or having a dedicated access to the other 58 of the $66 billion in rail from IIJA. I also think the predictable timing on the grant programs, where you would know in advance it's going to come out at the same time every year, doing one NOFO at a time as opposed to the combining. The combining really creates kind of a lumpy program that is hard to predict and hard to plan on. And then I do think from from Congress's point of view, the advance appropriations really do help make the program function and make it predictable. Trying to count on a program that's at the vagaries of an annual appropriations process is going to be, it's just hard to make any long-term planning based on that.
It was stated in another earlier testimony that the expense of doing this seemed to be kind of exorbitant. How do you absorb that, or how do you prepare for that type of thing? Is that something you know in advance of what it's going to cost you, the time it takes, or is it just, it seems like a moving target?
That for me still?
Yeah, either one of y'all. I know Mr. Winders looks like he's itching to answer, so go ahead, brother.
Thank you, Representative. Itching to answer may be a slight overstatement, but.
Well, you're reaching towards the buzzer, so
Yes, sir, I was.
I'll let you go, brother.
Yes, sir, I was. The question was, what can be done with the program, or how do we prepare for the costs? And the way we prepare for the costs is we have to keep our costs down very low. We don't have the ability to throw a lot of resources at something that for a grant program that in our experience, the playing field is slanted against us and we're probably not going to get anyway. So it keeps us from being able to do that. When we do need to do that, our coalition, as when we did the benefit cost analysis, was able to pool some resources and pay for that.
Do you have any way to share that information with other, maybe not your competitors, but people in an area where you're not, and maybe figure something out? Because it just seems to me these things are always, I guess they start out maybe in a good spot, but they always end up helping the big boys or somebody who's connected with somebody, and to me that just stinks.
Yeah. We would definitely like the playing field to be competitive. We think our project and many others in rural America will compete as a road, but they won't necessarily compete on all the other criteria that you mentioned, Representative.
I always say we need to put the best players in, Coach. And if Peyton Manning were, or if the NFL was Congress, Peyton Manning would probably still be waiting to get in. So thank y'all so much. I have 5 seconds, and I'll yield that back to the committee because I'm very generous like that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. The chair now recognizes Mr. Payne for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank our witnesses for offering their testimony today. Ms. O'Leary, in your testimony, you mentioned how Southeast Michigan Council of Governments strategically works with the local partners to determine the best entity to apply for grant opportunities. Through this process, what have your local partners learned about the grant application process, and has this spurred them to pursue additional funding from the federal government for competitive grants? I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of examples. One is under our Safe Streets for All application. We brought together local communities to talk about what their projects might be in our region. And in that first round, we consolidated about 30 local governments to submit their ideas, and we vetted them through. And we also included safety audits from SEMCOG. And actually, that time we weren't successful in getting it. We received the money to do the safety audits, but not to be able to do those individual community projects. So we had a conversation with the federal government about what was it needed to improve our application the next time, which we did, and we were happy that we received $10 million that now we're able to pass through to our communities directly. So that's one way we've brought them all together. The other is, right now, we're meeting with counties and cities together to apply for the climate pollution reduction grants, which I know is under the IRA, but we are bringing all of them together to look at what are the topics that are the most strategic to apply for, and we will be applying for a set of money as a region representing all of those entities again and passing through to them.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, I appreciated that your testimony refers to the need for funding predictability for rail. Thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law we now are operating with 5 years of guaranteed funding for freight and passenger rail. Let's see, I lost my space. Okay, let's see. Unfortunately, we're still dealing with the unpredictability of the annual appropriations process. Thank goodness we were able to reject the 65% cuts to Amtrak funding, including 93% cut to funding for the Northeast Corridor, along with the elimination of certain grant programs that some Republicans initially proposed. What does that funding mean, funding certainty mean for rail?
Thank you for the question. The advance appropriations, I've said earlier, is a game changer for rail. We've never had that before. Obviously, I represent the freight rail side and the short line freight rail side, and I don't get to speak for my Amtrak friends, but I feel confident in saying everyone in the rail industry recognizes the total shift in reality that the advance appropriations allowed. And it's a long-term business. We're on year 197 of railroading in the United States. It's the kind of thing we have rail in place from 1895, and we have locomotives that last 50 years long. It's big, heavy investments. They need to last a long time. They take long planning horizons, and waking up each year and seeing what the appropriations process provided is just not a realistic way to do it if you're serious about the program trying to be effective. So the advance appropriations is a huge deal.
Thank you. Yeah, and these are the types of efforts that on this side I always tried to make in order to move everyone forward in a positive manner. And, predictability is the key to saving money and having great success. So with that, sir, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. I want to thank you all for being here this morning, I guess now this afternoon. Mr. Baker, short line railroads are important to this nation, and Long Island, where I'm from, is not excluded. The New York and Atlantic Railway provides freight services on lines owned by the Long Island Railroad, transporting food products, building materials, waste and recyclables, among other products, to and from local, critical, important industry. This railroad is vitally important to my district and the rest of Long Island, Brooklyn, Queens, and the outer boroughs, as it forms a critical link connecting industries to the entire North American freight railroad network. The rail cars that travel also remove over 120,000 heavy truck trips from the roads and highways of New York City and reduce transportation emissions by 75%. It is important that short-line railroads such as the NYA are supported and have access to expedient federal funding. As you mentioned, short lines became eligible for the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Program administered by the Federal Railroad Administration to replace, upgrade, rehabilitate, and provide funding for countless other investments. Can you just explain why these grants are so critically important and why we need to continue funding them?
Thank you very much. The NYA is a unique short line, but at the end of the day, there's 600 short lines, and they all have their own unique story. One of the things they have in common is they tend to be small businesses with limited amount of customers, limited amount of revenue, but very, very expensive infrastructure to maintain. Blessedly, from the very beginning of short line world, Congress, both sides of the aisle, has really seen the public policy benefit in helping support short lines and allow them to preserve and maintain that infrastructure. And Chrissy has really taken that to a new level. We're very, very appreciative. I tried to start and end my testimony with that. We do have plenty of constructive suggestions for how it can work better, but Chrissy is crucial to short lines, and the New York Atlantic is a great success story, and you probably did my job better than I could do it. With all those trucks off the road in such a busy area, it's a big success.
So I think one of the criticisms that we've heard, and it's not just to this specific grant program, but I think grant funding programs, it's a problem, is the idea of when the grants are actually announced and when they are obligated or implemented. So what can the DOT do better to make sure that that funding, so when it's announced, the money's actually delivered much more expediently so it could be invested in infrastructure?
Yeah, the premise of your question is right on. It's an amazing delay. I mean, we have $6 or $7 million grants for basic track rehab, replace ties and rail, and it can be 3 years later by the time you're done with getting a categorical exclusion from the NEPA process and getting a historic preservation review. And so there are big opportunities for streamlining, and I think that would be a fantastic place for Congress to be pretty specific in the next reauthorization about mandating that streamlining. And I also think, as we spoke earlier, I think public accountability and transparency, putting these projects on some sort of dashboard, which I recognize would take a fair amount of work at FRA and would have to be, the staff would have to be paid for, but being public about where all these projects stand and what stage they're in, I think would help, and people would say, why have some of them advanced and the rest are sitting around not moving?
Thank you, Mr. Baker, and again, thank you all for being here. I now recognize Mr. Stanton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Successful implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law is our shared priority, and you, as key stakeholders, help us evaluate that effectiveness, so it's appreciated. Arizona, my home state, has received millions and millions in discretionary competitive grants. We benefited from $25 million raised grant that is funding the construction of a Rio Salado bike and pedestrian bridge, allowing the community to cross the riverbed in alignment with 3rd Street, connecting our community, promoting sustainability, advancing our shared vision for Rio Reimagined. Recently, we had an even bigger win. In January, Arizona received nearly $100 million in a competitive infra grant from the U.S. Department of Transportation for major improvements to widen Interstate 10, a major corridor, important not just to Arizona, but to the entire country. The grant was awarded to improve the safety and conditions on the 26-mile stretch of I-10 located entirely within the boundaries of the Gila River Indian community. That's what I want to raise today. The experience of our tribes and tribal governments, our nation-to-nation partners in the discretionary grant programs authorized by the bipartisan infrastructure law. Overall, the Department of Transportation has made improvements. There are over 155 grant programs that specifically make tribal governments eligible for funding. These programs range from broadband, highway safety, clean power, and resilience. However, the discretionary grant system is set up in a way that does not always work well for our tribal partners. Many grants, especially larger dollar grants like infra and mega programs, are only successful when states make the application. Tribes can't make the application directly with the federal government. Tribal governments are our sovereign federal partners, and despite the nation-to-nation relationship with our tribes, tribal governments often have to work underneath local and state governments to apply for these discretionary grants, even when they are technically eligible for the grant. They have the technical capability to apply for and implement the grant. Many matching grants create barriers. Sometimes there is a 20-25% match requirement with a minimum of $1 million or more. Tribal partners are deterred from applying. And even when they do have capacity and work with state and other partners, it is not always clear that the grant applications are made on behalf of the tribe. In my state, the Gila River community applied for a different discretionary grant funding for the I-10 widening for years. Last year when they were denied the mega grant, it was in part because they scored low on equity portion despite being a tribal government applying for these resources. Eventually, the Arizona Department of Transportation, working with many partners in the state, was able to secure an infra grant. But there is still much work to do to ensure our tribes and tribal governments, our nation-to-nation partners, are front and center as we evaluate discretionary competitive grant. So the bottom line is the system does not work as well as it could for tribes. I know that the self-governance of tribe works. I see it in my state over and over and over again as we have more than 20 outstanding tribes that do great work, professional work, and they deserve that support. We don't have a witness here speaking on behalf of tribes today, but some stakeholders like National Association of Counties, I want to give them a shout out. They work hard to bring tribal partners on their boards, on their working committees, et cetera. But ultimately, we need to do more. And I hope I can work with my colleagues here and stakeholders in front of us today to improve the system, make sure we evaluate the needs and sovereignty of our tribal partners, and make sure the grant program works better for them. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Sheriff Nails. Sheriff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Baker, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Baker was, D'Esposito just said, talked about grants, how we can, you mentioned streamlining grants, transparency, efficiency. Mr. Perdue, we talked a little bit about that with some of the other. This is Congress. This is Washington, D.C. Those words really don't exist in Washington, D.C., talking about streamlining and transparency. It certainly doesn't exist with this administration. Mr. Winters, you oversee associations of counties, right? How many counties in this great country of ours? I have an idea, but why don't you share with us?
About 3,000.
3,000, that's exactly right. 3,000 counties across the entire country. Did you know that in 2020, Joe Biden won 509 of them, 16% of counties. I think it would be good food, good thought here would you get back with me and let me know about these grants and how many of those grants, these grants that people are applying for, are going to the 509 counties? The lowest number ever. A president wins the election, he won it with just 509 counties, 16%. I'm kind of curious what it would look like to see where these grants, these discretionary grants are going. Maybe you can help me out with that a little later on. I tell you, Mr. Baker, I thank you for being here. I chair the railroads, right, the subcommittee on rails, and I love it. I love Chrissy grants. I think they're good. I believe it helps the Class 2s, Class 3s, and I like that robust funding. I've spoken to the Administrator Bowes on this, and I support that because I think that it's all about safety. But we don't talk too much about the Grade Crossing Elimination Act, the grade crossing. Now, how much money is in there for the grade crossings?
The grade separation program has $600 million a year guaranteed.
Is that enough?
That would do about 20 or 30 a year, and there are thousands that.
Listen, I had a hearing on this about a month or so ago. We were talking about, and I hear from all the individuals involved, and they said that's where the real danger lies. In cars, people going through the gates. Some of them don't have gates. Individuals being run over by trains, all sorts of issues at these grade crossings. So I like the idea, and I'm assuming you would support that, maybe even you, Ms. O'Leary, that we need to do something about actually addressing an issue. And the issue is, I think there's 220,000 grade crossings across the entire country. So we should be addressing those. We should be really, really passionate about that. Would you all agree with that? Yeah?
I would certainly agree with that. About 95%, and I know you know this, about 95% of the fatalities on the rail industry are grade crossings and trespassing. And it's unfortunately expensive, so it's a real challenge for the country. But separating the crossing, the safest crossing is one that doesn't exist. So
I'm with you. Ms. O'Leary, what do you think?
I agree with you.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Perdue, I'm from the great state of Texas, buddy. I think, did you say you're getting 1%? Is it a little over 1?
That's correct, just over 1% of the distribution.
You know where we are, the great state of Texas? A lot of people come to us too, buddy.
Much higher than that.
A little less than 2. We gained 2 seats in the House because everybody's leaving these other states, coming to your great state, coming to my great state. They're fleeing the oppression. And our formula is around 10%. And we're getting less than 2. How do you feel about that? Do you think that DOT is distributing these grants fairly? Would you say they're distributing them fairly?
I would say thus far, it's certainly not commensurate with population, lane miles, vehicle miles traveled, definitely not. Our formula allocation is around 5%, and we've only seen 1% of grant awards.
Well, I appreciate all the panel for being here, and it would just be a treat for the American people to see Congress working for them. We talked about cost overruns. I think Muser was talking about, or Rouser was talking in North Carolina about, let's just say $1 million project. Now after 3 years, all the red tape, NEPA, all this other stuff, environmental impact, it's 1.2. You know, who covers the other 200 million? In your testimony, I think it's the state DOTs and the local stakeholders. Is that right?
Yeah, Congressman, that's exactly right. I mean, for state DOT, we have to cover the cost increases and, you know, balance our finances. I would say for local governments, local communities, other entities that are much smaller, it's very difficult to manage.
And I would make an assumption because of the inefficiency, some of the projects, they say we can't do it anymore. We can't afford to come up with the cost overrun. Can't do it. Just
That has
eliminate it.
happened.
Shameful. We can do better. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Menendez, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate all the witnesses for appearing here today and their thoughtful testimony. I'm proud to say that my district has received over $11 billion in discretionary grants from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And after the prior testimony, I would just remind everyone that there is a project in every single congressional district, red and blue states, rural and urban, that's funded by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So we're putting this money to work across the entire country, regardless of whether those members voted for the bill in the 117th Congress. These funds are being used for several exciting projects in my district, including improving and updating the Bayonne Dry Dock, electrifying ferries in Elizabeth, improving road safety in Jersey City, and for the Gateway Program. The Gateway Program is the most urgent infrastructure project in the entire country. The Northeast Corridor is the most heavily used passenger rail line in the United States. The section that goes through my district, New Jersey's 8th Congressional District, handles 450 trains per day and over 200,000 daily Amtrak and New Jersey Transit passenger trips. This project is important not just for my district, but for the New Jersey, New York metropolitan region, and for anyone traveling on the Northeast Corridor. Ms. O'Leary, your testimony touches on the importance of infra and raised grants. As I just mentioned, our district has benefited from these programs, and the funds will go towards critical infrastructure projects. Can you talk more about the importance of consistency in funding these programs? Specifically, how does consistency impact regions and states' ability to plan for large projects such as the Gateway Program?
Thank you. Yes, consistency is very important with these programs. And I would say in Michigan, or at least in Southeast Michigan, prior to Bill, our ability to receive a lot of the raised funding and the predecessor names of that funding was more limited. The increased funding that's been available now through infra and raise has led to more projects in our region. One being the largest project on Mound Road, which I spoke to in my testimony, is the largest non-state funded project in the country at $100 million to upgrade the transportation along the economic development corridor of the defense industry.
Appreciate that. How would making these programs mandatory or formula-based impact planning for large projects?
I'm sorry, could you repeat
Sure.
that?
How would making these programs mandatory or formula-based impact planning for large-scale projects?
Well, what we see is with the formula funds, there's not enough of them to be able to do these large projects in our region. So I don't know if there's ever going to be enough formula funds to be able to do the kinds of projects that infra and raise are able to do. And so knowing that there is, even though they're discretionary, they're consistently coming out at a certain amount of money every year, gives us the consistency that we need and the reliability to be able to get ahead of applying for them, you know, a couple years down the road so that we're properly prepared with our applications.
Sure, I appreciate that. And how does operating under a continuing resolution impact these projects, specifically as it relates to planning and cost?
Operating under the continuing resolution has been a challenge more for the communities that have combined these ideas with congressionally directed spending projects and not being able to move on those and trying to figure out if those projects are really going to go or not go and if they should apply for grant funds instead. So the continuing resolution has been difficult in the planning for all infrastructure projects, especially you're playing the waiting game for projects that are in the congressionally directed spending right now.
Right, and it's an allocation of time and resources and thinking through what the different funding opportunities are, and not having that confidence makes you sort of question which path you should go, and that I imagine it makes it more difficult to plan, especially on these large-scale projects.
Yes, agree.
I appreciate it. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Yackle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today. It's an important hearing that we're having today on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IJA, which represented over $1 trillion in infrastructure spending, with a dramatic increase in discretionary spending. But each hearing examining IJA, I only grow more concerned that the American people aren't getting enough bang for their buck. I can tell you that in my home state of Indiana, we certainly aren't. We rank dead last on a per capita basis in securing IJA discretionary grants. And that's not just behind all states. It's behind all territories too, including Guam and American Samoa. Apparently, the Hoosier State just needs a few more friends at the Department of Transportation. I've been working with state and local officials to get a better understanding of why that is. But I'm also getting an earful on the grants that they do manage to win. For example, let's talk about a lack of clarity. In an attempt to be helpful, the DOT created a calendar of Notice of Funding Opportunities, or NOFOs. Despite these good intentions, however, agencies have missed their own deadlines, which has left to at least one project in my district in a funding lurch. Let's talk about complex applications. Local stakeholders are trying their best to keep things, quote unquote, in-house with limited resources. But the lack of success caused some of them to weigh the expanded expense of consultants who hopefully know the secret sauce or buzzwords to get their projects noticed. Others just aren't bothering to try applying for these funds. Let's talk about maddening feedback. I appreciate that the DOT will sit down with those who aren't yet awarded a grant or who don't get a grant application. But the feedback can be exasperating. One local stakeholder whose application was denied for a planning grant to study a potential grade separation had a debrief with DOT in which they told them that, quote, they might have scored higher if they had included a plan to add EV charging, because what better place to charge an electric vehicle under a railroad crossing? Let's talk about grant agreement delays. For the lucky who win a grant, the splashy press release goes out, but then they wait 6 to 8 months to finalize the grant agreement. In the meantime, no work can be done. Then again, it sounds like maybe they're getting off easy, but the average wait time for a 2021 raised grant was nearly 16 months to get an agreement. And finally, let's talk about inflation. As we all know, time is money. These delays come at a time of very high inflation. And let's be clear, the DOT's inflation index for highway construction is still hitting new highs, meaning project costs are still ballooning. One locality told me that recently won a grant. They're actually giving the money back to the DOT. Because in all the time that it took to go through the bureaucracy, the cost of the project tripled. I know communities and states across the country, including our witnesses here, are facing the same issues. I hope that we can look forward to the successor to IJA, and as we heed the experiences and place a renewed emphasis on formula dollars over discretionary grants. Let's get money to the states who know which projects need funding, and then get the money out the door as quickly and efficiently as possible. I want to return briefly to the topic of discretionary grants. According to DOT figures, only 93 of 418 grant agreements have been secured for raised grants awarded between fiscal years 2021 and 2023. And this question is for any witness. Can you just describe what are the bottlenecks and what would you do to speed up the process? It's like third grade school, so you can either answer or I'll start calling on you. So go ahead, Mr. Baker.
That ratio sounds similar to the program I'm most familiar with, which is Chrissy. You know, it's slow. It's always been slow, and it's probably slower now than it used to be as the program has gotten bigger as far as getting from announcement to actual agreement. How exactly to speed it up inside is a little bit opaque to grantees on the outside and myself, but I think, frankly, Congress could essentially just tell them to do it, in a future bill, just mandate that it go quicker. And I think, again, public transparency, putting it on a dashboard, explaining what's happening and why. And if it's not done on a certain timeline, let's say why. And sometimes it's the applicant's fault, and that's okay. But, Sunshine would fix that too.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. And finally, I do just want to say that in order to get these grants, we have to certify compliance with 75 federal laws and regulations, plus 12 executive orders before being awarded a grant. That seems maddening and dizzying to me. I think we can do better. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Desanye, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I request unanimous consent to enter into today's hearing record 4 documents supporting my colleague, Congressman Garamendi's questioning today.
Without objection.
Thank you. First, I just want to make a comment. He's no longer here. My good friend, Mr. Nels, in counties, Mr. Winders, having come from county government in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I was a county supervisor, a commissioner. This is just an observation. You have to respond. County officials get elected by county, presidents don't. I have my own questions about the Electoral College, so his observation about 500 counties. Your county, according to the website, is about 26,000 population. The county I represented for 14 years has about 1.2 million people. So I just want to make an observation, which is part of the challenge we have right here, is that we have this amazing infusion of public investment, the largest since President Eisenhower, in a country that's changed a lot since then, but still want to respect your community, my community, and doing that in a way, and this is to Ms. O'Leary, and I'd love to hear the Secretary's response too, because you have similar challenges. We do have similarities with Florida. We're both big states, California and Texas. In a world where you, having been on the MPO for the Bay Area for 10 years, and having been a county commissioner with local stuff, the idea, in my perspective, with this huge infusion is a huge challenge in a world that's changing. And then you overlay the requirements under the U.S. Clean Air Act, signed by Richard Nixon, and Californians were signed by Ronald Reagan. So getting the RTP passed with the state implementation plan, having this infusion of money, and having both the discretion and the mobility under the formula, and I agree with you on this, if the formula's right, but you still want to have discretionary grants that anticipates the changes we're under. So, Ms. O'Leary, you come from a region that's changed a lot, differently than the Bay Area for sure, but our big challenge now is COVID, and with the tech industry, 30, I would bet, higher than that, vacancy rates in downtown San Francisco. So our traditional commutes for my community, which has 4 of the 10 largest mega commutes in the country because of the cost of housing versus where the jobs are, we have a wonderful opportunity, but it's going to take us a long time, unfortunately, to respond to that change. So you have some history in Southeast Michigan of responding to private sector changes in a different way. How do we stay in, we have this bothersome infrastructure for a reason, and it was largely Republican administrations who wanted to get rid of corruption that was delivered more on political relationships than on performance. So this committee is supposed to be the least partisan. How do we get this money out the door, working with the administration and our Republican colleagues in a country that has such diversity, but has incredible demands to make it easier for people to get to work, whether it's in a rural community or an urban community. And by the way, those urban communities drive 65% of the gross domestic product in this country. So how do we keep that in this amazing opportunity, all those moving parts, and accelerate the RTP, but still do it thoughtfully without taking 20 years to get the research to validate what we're doing?
Well, you said a lot right there.
I know. You have a minute to answer.
And I'll say what you're saying is true. This is a challenge, and we say it's a good problem to have, right? We know that our job as regions, and often as counties and as the state, is to help our communities get ready. And so, yes, we are seeing this large influx in opportunity funds, many of them discretionary. And I feel personally that as regional leaders across the country, our job is to get our communities ready. you've seen a rebound and a resurgence in the Detroit area, the Detroit metropolitan area. If you haven't been to visit Detroit, you should be. It's the place to be. And infrastructure and what we're able to do there is a big part of it. And I would encourage people to look at what's happened in Detroit. The collaboration and the partnerships are a big part of the success that we're having.
Debbie Dingle's a good friend, so I hear from it all the
She's
time.
great.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I would say that IIJA did bring record funding in terms of federal authorization, and it's definitely good and something that should be continued into the future. With discretionary grants, the challenge is that we are being asked and expected to do more and to do more faster. It appears as though with discretionary grants, we're doing less and doing it slower. I think there's a lot of opportunities in formula distribution to really address that, because that's when the funds get pushed out and can actually go on to projects that are ready to be built.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. King, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Baker, it's good to see you again. The IIJA authorized a new railroad crossing elimination grant program. IIJA authorized $500 million annually in spending, subject to appropriations, and provided advanced funding of $600 million annually through FY26. What has been your experience with this program, and do you have any recommendations for improvements?
Thank you. The program is new creation in IIJA. There's been one round of funding. We think it meets a pressing need. It's a program that public entities apply for. Railroads don't individually apply, but obviously it has to be essentially in partnership with a railroad. I think it's addressing a pressing issue. I mentioned earlier, 95% of the fatalities on the rail system nationwide are either trespassers or grade crossings, and the busiest crossings, not only are they dangerous, but they also they block traffic sometimes, and people get upset, and it delays motorists. And really, the only way to permanently solve that problem is make it a grade separation. And so the program, it's a good idea. The challenge for the country is they're very, very expensive. You can be talking $20 or $30 million for one of these. So $600 million a year guaranteed might get you 30 crossings, which is excellent, but there's 220,000 in the United States. So I would say it's like all these DOT grant programs, it's been slow to get started. They're slow to execute, but once it's getting going, I think people will like how it works, and I think that there'll be an opportunity to increase that program even further in the next reauthorization.
Thank you. Commissioner Winders, what are the barriers that keep local governments, especially those in rural areas, from applying for discretionary grants?
Thank you, Representative. The key areas revolve around capacity, either the financial capacity to put together an application or the human capacity to wade through the notice of federal funding opportunity, or the capacity to provide to front the costs of a large project. So the notice is being complicated, and the capacity is necessary to wade through those and figure out what works for whom and whether or not we actually have a chance at any particular grant, whether it's worth our effort to put forward. Those are some of the major constraints, barriers.
Okay. Are there other things that Congress can do to help rural communities to secure DOT funding or for critical infrastructure? Any other recommendations?
There has been discussion about direct funding to counties. There's been discussion about building capacity, helping to build capacity. From my perspective, and I believe from NACO's perspective, the National Association of Counties perspective, if we can simplify the rules, make the goals of the program clear and more singular, not so many goals, then that would levelize the playing field. And what I mean by not so many goals is in the rating criteria, different counties have different abilities to compete on such things as clean air. In my rural county, we're not going to get many points for our road project as it relates to clean air, but it is a definite safety need, It's a need for the state and national system, but we don't rate well on those criteria. So maybe making sure that the criteria that the applications are rated on are the things that you as Congress want them to be rated on, not additional criteria.
Thank you. Targeted investments allow for the effective use of taxpayer funds. If we can start with you, Mr. Perdue, and then Ms. O'Leary. Can you talk a bit about what greatest benefit would be to state and then to municipal/regional governments as well? What would your recommendations be?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
What would your recommendations be from a statewide perspective, what I was just talking to Commissioner Winters about, and then from a municipal/regional perspective to Ms. O'Leary? So it's the same question from a statewide perspective and same question on a municipal perspective.
Sure. In terms of discretionary grants and specifically the NOFOs and the requirements in them, my suggestion or recommendation would be mainly focus the requirements in those NOFOs on the actual physical infrastructure and what it is meant to achieve. Moving people, moving goods safely and efficiently, bringing all these extra requirements in that some communities may be able to meet, others may not, as you've heard many times, makes it very challenging. I mean, it already takes a considerable amount of resources to pursue these grants.
Thank you. Ms. O'Leary?
I would say a couple of things. One, when it comes to the formula funds, the sub-allocation process works. It works on our TAP funds, being able to sub-allocate down to major metropolitan areas at least. And I think we had a good point earlier where we work hand in glove with our DOT, where our part of Michigan gets a sub-allocation for some dollars for TAP, but then the state works with the rest of the more rural areas to implement TAP programs across the rest of the state. So sub-allocate where it makes sense.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Moulton, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to take us all to a small town in my district, Andover, Massachusetts, where last year, a beautiful 5-year-old girl, Sydney Olson, was waiting for a walk sign to cross the street. And when the walk light changed and she got the signal, she started out across the street. And a big semi-truck, which couldn't see her, started forward. It bumped her. She tried to get out of the way. And then it jerked forward again and ran over her, ending her life instantly in front of her entire family. Now, this, of course, has devastated her family, her brother, her mom, and dad. It's devastated the truck driver, who didn't even know what had happened until after it happened. It's devastated a community. And what's particularly amazing is that this entire accident could have been prevented with a $50 mirror installed on that truck so that he could see what was in front of him. The same mirrors that are installed on school buses, so they don't do the same thing. I just want to emphasize that the changes that we're talking about making, and more that are in the works, have real urgency. We shouldn't have 5-year-old kids in small towns in America dying because they cross the street when they get a walk light. Mr. Leary, I know you spoke about the Safe Streets program and some of the impacts that it's had in the Detroit region. Could you speak a little bit more about what a difference this can make in your community?
Absolutely. And I'm sorry that that happened. And I think sometimes we, as the planners and the engineers, we talk about fatalities, but it's about people, and we can't ever forget that. So I'm sorry to hear about that happening. The Safe Streets for All is kind of a new program for us. So the first element of that is doing safety audits. We've been able to identify the most intersections and roadways that have the most injuries for pedestrian and bicyclists. And we're going there and we're doing the audits with this fund to figure out what's the next step. How do we fix those roads? And that's one of the roles that we play. The cities of Detroit and Dearborn both were able to receive actual construction funds. And so one of our jobs right now is, while they just received the funding, is to try and line up their funding on the safety side with the other funds that they've received for the repaving of the road, for example. And so that's, not always an easy task. So we're making sure as the MPO that we're aligning all of those projects together. And we know we need to make a difference, and that's why safety is our #1 concern in our region when it comes to our transportation network.
Well, I just think that, we talk a lot about congestion and travel speeds, and, everyone seems to be eager to add a lane to another highway, despite the enormous amount of empirical evidence that that doesn't decrease congestion or travel times. But we often forget the fact that these roads are going through communities. They're going through communities with people that we're encouraging to walk, because it's good, it's healthy. Of course, we'd have a lot fewer road fatalities and traffic deaths in America if we had a better rail system. It's a safer way to transport goods. It's a safer way to transport people. In the rest of the world, it's a nicer and faster way to get around the country as well, although we have a very antiquated rail system in the United States. One thing I've never really understood, Mr. Baker, is when we have these rail crossing elimination programs, why is it always rail funding? Why does it always fall on the railroads to eliminate crossings when in most parts of the country, the roads came after the railroads? The roads are the ones that have the problem with crossings. So why are highway funds not used to close crossings?
It's a fair question, and to be fair, the traditional Section 130 program is actually highway money, but it's only $200 million a year, which is not even a drop in the bucket as far as 200,000 crossings. The rail crossing elimination program is a big increase in that, and I think a step in the right direction, but it actually sounds to me sort of promisingly like a bipartisan area of agreement where there is clearly interest on both sides in really increasing that. And some of these crossing fatalities are the most stubborn part of rail safety. They're extraordinarily frustrating for us in the industry and obviously devastating every time there's an accident there. We would love to see more crossings closed and work with communities if they can access the funds to do it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope that communities will consider using funds to make safety improvements like the safe streets, like eliminating crossings, instead of just adding more lanes to highways. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Mr. Burleson, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Perdue, some of the largest grants that we've seen, they were found at the Department of Transportation, were the electric vehicle charging station grants. Two of these grant programs can be found in the IIJA, which were authorized at the tune of $7.5 billion. And I know Florida, that's still a lot of money. In Missouri, that's a lot of money. We can talk all day about the issues with electric vehicles, but with our limited time, I wanted to ask you if you think that these charging station grants were actually good for the states.
Thank you, Congressman. So in Florida, we are proud of the fact that the private industry has always done a great job of fueling vehicles. I do not believe it should be any different for the power that it takes to charge electric vehicles. This is just one more type of transportation. It's one more fuel type. We encourage fuel freedom. We would like to see the development of all fuel types and all alternative fuels, and we believe the private sector can really meet that mark. With regards to IIJA, there's discretionary grant money for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. There's also a new required formula program that was rolled out, and we received roughly $198 million over 5 years. We have taken those funds and developed a plan and identified gaps in locations, but there are still major hurdles and challenges and concerns to get over before we actually roll that program out. I know several states have already begun implementing it. It's looking like, and this is public funding, and it's looking like every location, based on the requirements in the program, are costing around $750,000 to $1 million per site. So it's a significant investment. And one big question we have in Florida, our adoption rate for EVs right now is around 1.3%. And so this is public money building public infrastructure. Assuming our adoption rate continues to move that slowly, is this a wise investment of public infrastructure dollars?
And the other question, Mr. Perdue, is there the infrastructure to support it? There was an article that came out today from the Washington Post. The title of the article says, "Amid explosive demand, America is running out of power." It continues to say that vast swaths of the United States are at risk of running out of power as electricity-hungry data centers and clean technology factories proliferate around the country, leaving utilities and regulators grasping for credible plans to expand the nation's creaking power grid. In Georgia, the demand, I'm going to paraphrase, is so high that it would take the equivalent, that the expectations are now 17 times that they will have this 17 times the current need that they have today. In other states, they're saying that they would have to scramble to implement numerous nuclear power plants just to accommodate the planned infrastructure growth of the data centers and all of these. And with that in mind, would you agree with me that this is the federal government pouring gasoline on the fire of something that's probably already a crisis in America?
I would say that it's definitely not sustainable to focus all of your efforts on just one fuel type. Again, having a diverse portfolio in transportation is truly how you are sustainable for many, many years to come. Electric vehicles are just one type. A lot of people in Florida are still choosing gas and diesel. I personally drive a truck with a diesel engine, and I will drive that for the rest of my life. And, I'm a Floridian, I'm American, I have the right to do that. And so, I think developing that infrastructure out in a way that is diversified and really brings all of the alternative fuels to the table is the best path forward.
Thank you, Ms. Perdue. I agree with your comments. This is why I sponsored a bill here in Congress called the Unplug EVs Act, which will eliminate our taxpayer funding for these charging stations, which, as you mentioned, the private sector has been doing for quite some time. Thank you, and I yield the rest of my time.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize myself for the next several minutes since I have the total captive audience here, so thank you very much. Secretary Perdue, and all of you, I've really learned a lot this morning, so thank you for what you've done, for being here today. But I'm sure that you understand as well as anyone that once DOT announces a grant award, the process is far from over. There was a city in my district received a build grant, but is now unfortunately experiencing how frustrating the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, review process can be. In this case, the NEPA process took 2 years before the city could even submit the proposed environmental assessment, which then took another 5 months before it was approved by the Federal Highway Administration. I couldn't agree more with your testimony that wasted time is wasted money. Can you please share some advice that I may pass on to my community as to how to help navigate this process?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And yes, delivering infrastructure with federal funds is a very complex process. It takes a lot of resources, a lot of expertise. At FDOT, we're happy to partner with our local communities. There is a major challenge for the direct recipients of these grants if they're local governments and communities that are not accustomed to delivering infrastructure with federal funds. NEPA is one of those. Florida is one of the few states that has NEPA delegation in partnership with FHWA, and we've done a great job with that. We recently renewed our MOU with FHWA, but NEPA can take up to 4 years depending on how complex the project is. This is one of the reasons why we really believe even with discretionary grant programs, the requirements and the NOFOs and the things that you're asking for out of those that are applying for grants should be focused on the actual hard infrastructure and what it's trying to achieve. Moving people, moving goods safely and efficiently. This is the fundamental tenet of all transportation infrastructure. That's really where it should be focused. When you do that, the actual grant applications and the grants you're applying for and the projects you're trying to move forward are those projects that local communities have been planning for the last 15 to 20 years.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baker, we have several companies, including the Mississippi Export Railroad, which are independent, short rail lines that employ many individuals in my district. I also understand that several times Congress has directed the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, ACHP, to issue a final exemption for active rail corridors under NEPA and Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. This is similar to the interstate highway exemption. However, several years have passed and the ACHP still has not implemented this guidance. Why do you think railroads are not treated the same as highways under these exemptions?
It's a great question. I don't know why they're not. I also, and I'm not an expert on ACHP and congressional oversight of it, but I don't know why it's okay or how it's okay that they refuse to do what Congress pretty clearly told them to do, which is also a common sense fix, is to not treat the entire rail corridor as a historic item. If they want to designate specific sections, that would be okay, just like they do with the highway system. But it results in some crazy stories. We don't have time for me to repeat all of them, but there's a railroad in Massachusetts told me about a bridge that took them a year of historic review to get through, and then it took them 4 hours to replace the bridge.
Does this impact project cost? Does this impact project cost and how quickly a railroad can fulfill a project obligation?
It does. It causes huge delays. It causes some funny stories. The one I just mentioned, a railroad up in Minnesota just told me about a wooden bridge that they just need to replace one support beam with a big concrete beam, and they eventually got approval to do it, but they were told they have to paint the concrete beam the color of wood to get it done. And so, sometimes they're a little silly, but again, time is money. We've said it ad nauseum this morning, and ACHP should do what Congress asked.
Agree. Do you see DOT working to reduce NEPA reviews to help projects get done any faster, or are there any improvements you can recommend?
We have not seen a huge amount of progress on making the NEPA and environmental process move faster. There's a lot of good intentions when we talk to people at FRA. They want to move projects quickly, just like we do, but it hasn't really seemed to happen yet. From a short line point of view, the vast majority of our projects end up getting categorical exemptions, but even that process is slow, and it's very frustrating. If you're just replacing wooden ties on an existing rail corridor, an existing active rail right-of-way, it is sort of blindingly obvious to everyone that that's going to end up with a categorical exemption, and I don't understand why we couldn't just start tomorrow and let's just start building, right? Let's not wait around for the obvious answer that takes sometimes 6 months, 8 months, a year.
Exactly. Mr. Winters, in the time that I have left, which I've run over, if you could expand some of the issues you may have faced on a county level, trying to raise non-federal match funding while waiting for DOT to announce grant awards.
I'm sorry, Representative, trying to raise what?
Non-federal match funding.
Yeah, non-federal match funding is an issue for Audrain County, for the Highway 54 Coalition, and for many rural counties. Particularly the RAISE grant has an exemption for rural counties that does not require match. However, it's questionable as to whether or not your application will be competitive without match. At this point, given our experience with the RAISE program and our inability to get a grant, we have not tried to set aside match money for something that we're just not sure we're going to get.
Right. Thank you. Are there any further questions from any members of the committee who have not been recognized? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today. I would like to thank each of you for your testimony today. The committee stands adjourned.